Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's gentle journey into the past, a quiet voyage through the shadowed corridors of time, where candles flicker in tall iron sconces and wedding bells toll across the cobbled lanes of medieval villages. In this story, we'll uncover what weddings were truly like in medieval times, the customs, the secret whispers before vows, the silent glances between betrothed nobles, and the strange, sometimes haunting, rituals behind veils and garlands. Our tale is not told in haste. Instead, it unfurls slowly, like a scroll of worn parchment, brushed open by the breeze of curiosity and bathed in the twilight hush of history. So, tuck into your blankets, let your breath fall into rhythm with the gentle murmur of the past, and let's begin, part by part, story by story. Once a very long time ago, when kings ruled by divine right and the peasants lived by candlelight, weddings weren't simply a celebration of love. They were a transaction, a duty, a safeguard, and on rare, precious occasions, they were a whisper of affection, nestled in the storm of obligation. Our story begins in the year 1224 in the village of Leopold, a real place once, though now long since faded from the maps. In this little hamlet of moss-covered thatch and crooked timbered walls lived a girl named Ellen. She was the daughter of the reeve, the local land steward, and at the tender age of 14, she was preparing for her wedding. Ellen had never met the boy she was to marry. His name was Godefroy. He was 15, broad-shouldered, with pale eyes and a scar along his jaw from a sheepdog's bite. Godefroy's father had arranged the match with Ellen's father months ago at the midsummer fair, under the smoky canvas of a cider tent while haggling over goats and grain. This, dear listener, was how many medieval marriages began. Not with roses or confessions, but with handshakes and mead. Love, if it was to be found at all, came after. Ellen didn't cry when she was told. She had known since she was small that she would marry whomever her father chose. And so, she stitched the white linen of her bridal camise, thread by thread, in a rhythm as ancient as the bells that tolled each morning from the chapel on the hill. Now here is something many forget. Medieval weddings weren't grand cathedral ceremonies. Not for common folk. For Ellen, the wedding would take place on the church porch, not inside. That was law. Only nobles wed within holy walls. The peasants' union would be solemnized outside, beneath the gaze of neighbors, chickens, and the mossy stone arch. And yet, it was sacred. The morning of the wedding dawned misty and cold. Ellen rose before the sun, her fingers trembling as she braided her hair. Her gown, simple and unadorned, was girdled at the waist with a woolen sash dyed red for fertility. Her mother tied it slowly, humming an old chant to St. Bridget under her breath. Outside, the village had gathered, not out of joy, but curiosity. Weddings were a community affair, a rare break from toil and the promise of bread and ale afterward. Godefroy stood beside Father Edric, tall and solemn. When Ellen approached, her head bowed. She could feel the hush settle. And then the ritual began. The priest did not ask if they loved one another. He did not speak of romance. Instead, he asked, "Do you take this woman to wife, to hold and to guard as the church doth command?" Godefroy answered, "I do." Then Ellen spoke her vow, quiet but steady as her father placed her hand into Godefroy's. They exchanged no rings. That was for wealthier folk. But the priest bound their hands in a strip of embroidered linen, the hand fasting, a practice older even than the church's dominion. The fabric, scented faintly of lavender, had been Ellen's mother's once. The blessing concluded with holy water, a brief Latin invocation, and a simple kiss. No fanfare, no music, just the murmuring wind and the sigh of nearby trees. Afterward came the churching, a blessing for Ellen's fertility. She was taken to the altar alone, barefoot to kneel. The ritual was half pagan, half Christian, a prayer for healthy children and open wombs. Then came the feast. Ellen and Godefroy were led to the reeve's longhouse, where benches lined the walls and rushes covered the floor. Clay pitchers overflowed with small beer, and trenchers, round loaves of bread, were piled with roast goose, salted pork, and stewed cabbage. There were no silver forks, only knives and fingers. The village fiddler played a slow reel. No one danced, not yet, only after the bedding. Ah yes, the bedding ceremony. This was the part Ellen feared. When the feast ended, the crowd followed the couple to the bridal chamber. There, the bed had been freshly stuffed with straw and layered with woolen blankets. Ellen's cheeks flushed as she was helped out of her gown by her mother and aunts. Godefroy, too, was stripped by his brothers. Then, to laughter and lewd jokes, they were tucked into bed, together. Some villages left them alone. Others stayed to witness the consummation or to listen at the door for confirmation. That night, Ellen stared at the rafters above her, counting the knots in the wood, while Godefroy's hand rested nervously on her hip. They did not speak. Sleep came eventually, slow and strange. By dawn, the wedding was over. But the marriage and its duties had only begun. That, dear listener, was the beginning of Ellen and Godefroy's story, one of thousands like it, a tale of tradition, of duty, of strange beauty and deeper silences, and it is only one glimpse into the world of medieval weddings, a world we shall keep exploring. When you're ready, I'll share the next part. In the days that followed Ellen's wedding, the air in Leofum seemed to shift, just slightly. The fields, damp with morning dew, no longer seemed like places of childhood games but of daily work, where hands must blister and back must bend. Ellen now woke beside Godefroy each morning, their breaths mixing in the cold hush before dawn, when even the birds dared not speak. Marriage in the medieval countryside was not a gentle adjustment. It was more like a plunge into icy water, shocking, bracing, and expected to be endured without complaint. Ellen's mother taught her how to keep the hearth warm even as the roof above leaked from last year's thaw. She showed her how to mend tunics while minding the butter churn, how to knead barley bread while coaxing stubborn hens to lay. Godefroy's family, though not wealthy, had land, and land meant work. Ellen's hands, once smooth from embroidery, grew calloused. Her fingernails held the scent of soil and onion skin. Yet it was not all hardship. There were quiet moments, like when Godefroy, too shy to speak, brought her a bunch of violets he'd found blooming beside the creek. He had never learned the language of romance, but in that single gesture, Ellen sensed his quiet kindness. They sat on a fallen tree and said little. There was comfort in silence. As the weeks passed, the villagers, ever watchful, began to murmur about whether Ellen took well to marriage. For in those times, a wife's worth was measured not by happiness, but by how swiftly her belly swelled. One evening, as the fire crackled and the smoke drifted lazily upward into the thatch, Ellen's mother-in-law leaned close and pressed a hand against her stomach, not cruelly, but with the practiced habit of women who had buried more children than they had raised. "Not yet?" she asked softly. Ellen only shook her head. You see, in medieval times, fertility was not simply a private matter. It was a communal concern, a matter of survival. A child was not just a blessing. It was a worker, an heir, a name carried forward. Ellen felt the pressure coil tightly around her each day the moon returned without change. Godefroy tried not to show his worry. But at night, as they lay beneath their coarse woolen blanket, he asked, almost apologetically, "Did you take the St. Agnes charm I carved?" She nodded. It hung beneath her shift, the tiny cross worn smooth from her fingertips. She had whispered to it every night. When spring arrived, Leofum came alive again. The trees stretched green fingers toward the sky, and the lambs stumbled across the meadows in clusters of soft bleats. It was during the rogation days, 3 days of fasting and prayer, that Ellen visited the chapel again. The villagers walked the bounds of the parish, singing hymns and calling on saints to bless the land, the crops, and the wombs of their daughters. At one old boundary marker, a weathered oak with a cross carved deep into its bark, Ellen placed her hand and prayed quietly for a child, her voice trembling like the leaves overhead. That night, a dream came. She stood in the chapel, but the windows were open to a storm. Rain lashed through the air, yet the altar stood dry. There, resting on the cloth, lay a single white rose, untouched by the wind. When she reached for it, the petals scattered, each transforming into tiny doves that flew around her head in a hush of wings. She told no one of the dream, not even Godefroy. But deep inside her, something shifted. In those days, dreams carried meaning. The old women of the village, women with milky eyes and toothless mouths, said that doves were the souls of unborn children, and that if one visited you, a child would follow. Ellen waited. The months passed slowly, each marked by the turning of chores. Summer brought shearing, hay gathering, and the constant clanging of pots. She moved through it all with the rhythm of someone watching for signs, A missed moon, a sudden craving, the brush of nausea after breaking fast. And then, one evening in August, the stew pot turned her stomach. The meat, which had always been scarce and cherished, made her recoil. She said nothing, waited 3 more days. Then 4. Her mother, observant as always, brought her a sprig of rue and tied a blue ribbon around Ellen's wrist. The color blue, the virgin's color, was believed to protect pregnant women from misfortune, witches, and restless spirits. News spread quickly. Soon, the entire village knew. Old Mattie the Thatcher carved a cradle frame from spare oak. Mistress Warren, who brewed pennyroyal, packed her herbs away out of sight. The smith's wife, who had buried her own twins in the frost of 19, sent a blanket, coarse but warm. It was in these months that Ellen began to feel married in a new way. Godefroy, once stiff and hesitant, now asked after her every evening. He made her a stool so she wouldn't have to squat at the wash house. He learned to bind her sandals so the straps wouldn't press into her swollen ankles. Their marriage, once only a contract, now pulsed with something unfamiliar, care. And yet, beneath it all, there was fear. In medieval times, pregnancy was a gamble. 1 in 3 women died in childbirth. There were no midwives in Leopold, only old Nanwith, who knew how to turn a breech baby and whose hands smelled always of smoke and thyme. As Ellen's belly grew round, she visited Nanwith more often. The old woman told her strange things, to avoid seeing the moon on her back, to never step over a cat, to wear iron on her ankle to keep the spirits out. And Ellen obeyed, not because she believed, but because fear makes believers of us all. By late November, snow dusted the village like sifted flour. The hearths burned longer, and the night stretched wider. Ellen, now heavy with child, stayed mostly indoors, weaving, resting, and dreaming of the spring. One night, as the wind howled outside like wolves on the moor, she told Godefroy of her dream, the one from many months before. He listened, his hand gently resting on her belly, where a faint kick thumped beneath his palm. "She'll be a girl," he whispered. Ellen smiled, though she dared not say it aloud. To guess was considered unlucky. As the fire faded to embers and the snow crept against the doorframe, they held each other in silence, knowing that soon everything would change again. Not just for them, but for the rhythm of the village, for the names in the chapel book, and for the stories whispered beside the hearth. For now, though, Ellen waited, and so did the world around her. With breath held and prayers said, in the hush of midwinter sleep, the snow fell for 3 days straight. Thick and quiet, it blanketed Leopham in a hush, so complete that even the dogs barked less. Roofs sagged under its weight, and the creek near the chapel froze into jagged silence. It was during this deep winter, when breath became mist in every room and even the oxen huddled together for warmth, that Ellen's labor began. It started with a dull ache, no sharper than the usual strain in her back. She said nothing at first. She lit the hearth, stirred the morning pottage, and tried to stitch a tear in Godefroy's tunic. But her fingers kept slipping, her breath catching with each wave of pressure that crept around her spine and curled low into her belly. By the time dusk darkened the windows, the pain no longer came in waves. It arrived like thunder. Godefroy, pale and wordless, ran barefoot through the snow to fetch Nanwith. She came with her bundle of herbs and her hard hands, wrapped in a cloak that smelled of smoke and sheep's wool. She sent Godefroy away with a flick of her wrist, then closed the shutters tight. In medieval homes, there was no soft bed, no sterilized linen, no warm light. Just straw, a wooden stool, and the sharp scent of blood already thick in the air before the first scream rose. Nanwith whispered prayers in a language older than Latin. She crushed mugwort leaves and rubbed them into Ellen's temples. When the pain became unbearable, she held Ellen's hand, but not gently. She whispered again, this time to the child, telling it to come fast, to come head first. Outside, Godefroy paced through the snow, leaving long, cold trenches. The villagers had seen the candle placed in the window, the silent signal. A birth was underway. Soon, shapes began to gather in the distance, cloaked and still, heads bowed against the wind. They waited in the night, as was custom, for either news or mourning. Hours passed, then more. Inside, the fire crackled low. Ellen's strength ebbed, her cries growing hoarse. Nanwith bit her lip and reached for the iron scissors, rusted but sacred, to cut the birthing cord. The candle guttered, flickered, then flared again as if gasping. And then, at last, the cry. A shrill, clear wail, like the call of a hawk over frozen fields. A girl. Nanwith wrapped the baby in a linen cloth embroidered with blue thread. She handed her to Ellen, who blinked through sweat and tears, too exhausted to smile, but alive. Godefroy returned to find them both breathing. He didn't speak, only fell to his knees beside the pallet and rested his forehead against Ellen's arm. His hands trembled. He was still a boy, barely 16, and yet that night, the way he looked at his wife and child made something shift in him, something irreversible. They named the child Isolde after Ellen's grandmother, who had died long before the plague. For the first 3 days, no one outside the household saw the baby. She was kept wrapped in layers of wool, close to her mother's skin, guarded by charms tied above the door. Sprigs of rowan, a sliver of bone carved with a protective rune, and a bit of iron wire. It was believed that spirits roamed closest in the days following birth, drawn by new life, by open flesh, by weakness. Some said the souls of unbaptized infants drifted near, jealous and bitter, eager to snatch what had been given to another. So they watched the door and kept the fire burning day and night. On the 4th day, Isolde was taken to the chapel. Baptism, even for peasants, was urgent. If the child died unbaptized, she would not be buried in consecrated ground. Worse, some believed she would rise again, not as a ghost, but as a twisted creature, a revenant. The ceremony was brief and cold. Father Edric, his fingers red with chill, scooped water from the stone basin and poured it over the baby's brow. The water steamed against her warm skin. She did not cry. The villagers took this as a sign of strength. Ellen, wrapped in a gray shawl, stood beside Godefroy and watched. Her face was drawn, her eyes bruised with fatigue, but her mouth bore the trace of something close to pride. Afterward, the village celebrated in quiet ways. Mistress Warren baked a honey loaf. Old Mattie the Thatcher gave Ellen a carved spoon for feeding. The baker's daughter, barely 10, offered a small doll made of rags and chicken feathers. No gifts of silver or silk, no musicians, just kindness, passed from hand to hand like shared bread. As the days turned to weeks, Ellen began to heal, slowly. The bruising faded. The stitches, done by firelight and steady hands, held firm. She bled less each day. She could sit up, feed the baby, even walk to the door without help. But beneath the surface, something had changed in her. Not just her body, stretched and marked by birth, but something quieter. Her gaze lingered longer. Her breath came more slowly. She moved as if she now knew a secret that others did not. Childbirth had opened a door within her, one she could never close. Isolde, too, grew. Her eyes opened to the world, blinking up at the soot-dark ceiling beams and the flickering firelight. She cried often, especially in the hours between dusk and midnight. Godefroy learned to rock her, to murmur soft nonsense that made no sense, but soothed all the same. Ellen taught herself to nurse, though it hurt at first. She whispered old lullabies she had not sung since she was a child herself. Songs about willow trees and rivers that carried sorrow away. As Isolde learned to grip fingers, to smile in her sleep, to blink at candlelight, she became part of the rhythm of the household. Another breath in the night, another heartbeat in the quiet. Winter held the village in its frozen palm for many weeks more. During those long nights, as the fire whispered in the hearth and the snow hissed against the door, Ellen would sometimes look at her daughter and wonder what life awaited her. Would she marry at 14, as Ellen had? Would she bear children before she'd ever spoken her heart aloud? And deeper still, Ellen wondered whether her daughter would have a choice. But those questions would wait. For now there was warmth, there was breath, there was the smell of milk, and the faint lull of sleep creeping in at the edges. Outside, the snow began to soften. Not melt, not yet, but soften. Enough to hint that spring was not lost, only slumbering. Spring arrived in Leopold with a slow sigh, a long, quiet exhale after the weight of winter. The first sign was not the snow's retreat, but the birds. Small, sharp singing things that darted through the trees, their wings flickering like candlelight. Then came the thaw, dripping from rooftops and pooling in the ruts of muddy paths. By the time the first buds dared to peek from the hedge near the chapel, Isolde was nearing 3 moons old. Her hair, a dark auburn like Ellen's, curled at the nape of her neck, and her eyes, once the uncertain gray of newborns, had begun to deepen into something steadier, a shade like storm-washed earth. Ellen, too, had changed. She no longer moved cautiously. Her step was firmer now, though always aware of the child she carried against her breast. Her hips ached less, her back more. She had resumed her place among the other women, though they now regarded her not only as Ellen the Reeves' daughter, but as Ellen the mother. The village accepted this change without comment. In medieval life, identity was as fluid as seasons, and motherhood was not a role you stepped into, but one you were handed, like a yoke or a blade. The year's work began in earnest with the Feast of St. Walburga. The fields were readied with prayer and plow. Godefroy worked long hours with his father, turning the soil, his hands wrapped in leather, his back already sunburnt from the sharp March light. At night his body ached, but he still found time to hold Isolde. He would trace the soft curve of her cheek with one calloused finger, marveling that something so small had come from hands like his. Ellen began spinning wool again. Her spindle, once set aside during her confinement, now danced in her fingers each morning as Isolde slept. The rhythmic twist of fiber into thread became a comfort, a quiet reclaiming of routine. Life returned in patterns. Milk boiled over in clay pots. Chickens squabbled in the yard. The chapel bell tolled each seventh day. Babies were born, old folk died, and bread was kneaded with the same slow strength it always had been. And yet, beneath the sameness, something stirred. It began with talk, whispered between the men as they sharpened scythes or walked the boundaries of pasture land. A noble was coming. Word had traveled from village to village that a retinue would pass through Leofam on its way north. A baron, or perhaps the son of a duke, the details shifted with each telling. What remained consistent was this: they would need lodging, food, and space to rest their horses. For a place as small and plain as Leofam, this was monumental. Nobles rarely passed so close. Their presence meant disruption, but also opportunity. Ellen first heard the news from Father Edric, who visited her home in late March. He came not for Isolde's blessing, that had already been done, but to speak with her father about preparations. The chapel must be swept, he said, and flowers gathered. The Reeves' house would host 2 of the noble servants. The rest would be camped near the creek. Ellen's father nodded, calm as always, though his eyes carried a tightness she hadn't seen since the last tax collection. When Father Edric left, Ellen sat with her mother near the hearth, brushing Isolde's soft hair. "Will they bring soldiers?" she asked. "Of course," her mother replied, not unkindly. "And with soldiers come rules, and with rules, danger." Ellen said nothing. She remembered stories passed in whispers during harvest of girls taken from farms near royal roads, not always violently, sometimes just taken, married off to old men for debts, carried off to serve in castles, never seen again. She held Isolde a little closer that night. In the days that followed, Leofam transformed. Paths were cleared. The village well was repaired with fresh stone. Children were warned not to run near the horses when they came. Even the old signpost at the edge of the woods was scrubbed and repainted with ochre. Ellen helped prepare the guest rooms, sweeping out the loft above the Reeves' house and laying down straw fresh from the spring shearing. She hung lavender in the corners and lined the wooden chests with sprigs of mint. She wore her hair covered now, not because of the visitors, but because she was a mother. It was custom, a quiet marker of her change. The linen coif framed her face in soft folds, making her look older, wiser. Godefroy carved new stakes for the garden fence. He spoke little of the noble visitors, but Ellen could tell he was uneasy. He sharpened his tools twice, then checked the bindings on their single cow's shelter, as though expecting a storm, not a guest. The day the retinue arrived, the village stood still. They came with clatter and gleam, hooves heavy against the damp road, armor catching the light like shards of polished mirror. Flags snapped in the wind, red, black, and gold, though no one in the village could read the heraldry. The Baron was younger than expected. His cloak, fur-lined and heavy, swept the ground behind him. His face was pale, untouched by sun or toil. He did not smile. Ellen watched from a doorway, Isolde in her arms, heart tight. She knew better than to speak or be seen. Peasant women were to be invisible, especially those of childbearing age. She drew back into the shadows. The Baron's men drank their ale with little gratitude, but did not destroy the house. That was considered good fortune. One of them, a squire with a twisted leg, said thank you when handed his bread. Another spat in the yard. They stayed for 3 days. During that time, the chapel bell rang twice, once for a prayer offered by the nobleman's priest, and once when the baron inspected the fields. Ellen never saw him up close, but she did see the girl. She was young, younger than Ellen, and rode at the rear of the procession. Her hair was pale gold, braided with blue ribbon, and she wore a gown of fine wool that shimmered in the spring light. She did not smile either. Her eyes were downcast. Ellen only saw her because she had stepped outside to gather water. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, the girl on her palfrey, the young mother at her door. Something passed between them. Not recognition, but a kind of echo. Ellen wondered, was the girl promised? Already married? Would she be led, like Ellen once was, to a church porch and handed like a parcel to a stranger? The girl disappeared into the trees beyond the village, her horse's hooves muffled by moss and distance. When the baron's party left, Leofum exhaled. Life resumed with its slow rhythm of sowing and waiting. But in Ellen's heart, something remained, a flicker, a question. Not just for herself or her daughter, but for all the girls who lived in the spaces between banners and fields, between porch and altar, between silence and voice. She hummed an old lullaby to Isolde that evening, the kind her own mother used to sing. One about a river that carried secrets, and a swan that never forgot its name. The summer of that year settled upon Leofum like a warm, golden hush. It came slowly, unfurling itself over the fields and winding lanes, softening the edges of the village with light. The barley grew tall and pale, swaying in gentle waves. Bees hummed in the hedgerows, and children ran barefoot, their laughter dancing behind them like ribbons. Ellen spent her mornings beneath the old elm near the well, Isolde tucked in a cradle fashioned from a willow basket, shaded with linen. As she spun wool or peeled turnips, the world drifted around her in a slow circle of sound and scent. Clucking hens, distant church bells, the sharp sweetness of crushed mint leaves underfoot. She found comfort in the repetition, the way her hands remembered without asking, the rhythm of domesticity in a time when days were measured not by clocks, but by the length of shadows and the baking of bread. Yet, beneath the surface of the ordinary, something else stirred. It was Godefroy who first noticed. He had returned early one evening from the southern pasture with a worried brow. The sheep had been restless, he said, their tracks strange, clustered, panicked, and one was missing. No blood, no sign of fox or wolf, just silence and the smell of disturbed earth near the edge of the woods. That night, the wind shifted. It came down from the hills with a sour breath, and the hearth fire burned unevenly, flaring and sputtering. Nanwith muttered about spirits moving beneath the soil, their rest disturbed. She sprinkled crushed sage in the corners of her cottage and tied bells to her doorpost. The villagers murmured. Strange happenings in the summer were uncommon, but not unknown. It was said that in warm months, the veil between worlds, that fragile skin separating the living from the unseen, sometimes thinned. If a child was born with a call, or if a dog howled with no cause, people would cross themselves and avoid mirrors after dusk. Ellen, practical and quiet, said nothing, but she began tying a red thread around Isolde's wrist each morning. A small thing, an old thing, protection. One afternoon, while collecting herbs near the stream, Ellen found something odd, a ribbon. It was fine, blue silk, frayed at one edge. She turned it in her fingers, heart thudding. It reminded her of the girl she'd seen, the noble girl on the palfrey weeks ago. She'd worn blue in her braid. There were no noblemen nearby now. The ribbon had no place here. She brought it home and tucked it into the rafters, just in case. That evening, after Isolde had drifted to sleep, Ellen asked her mother what she remembered of the old ways, the stories told before the priests came, before the saints replaced the spirits in the hedgerows. Her mother was slow to answer. She stirred the pot of lentils, the wooden spoon creaking against the clay bowl. Then she said, "My grandmother said there are places in the woods where time folds, where women walk too far and return with silver hair, or children vanish and return years later with no memory." Ellen asked, "Are they true?" Her mother did not look up. All stories are true for someone. The next day, news came from the next village over. A girl had gone missing. 13 years old, last seen near the stone circle on the hill. Her shoes were found, side by side, toes pointing north. Father Edric declared a day of prayer and fasting. The villagers filed into the chapel with quiet mouths and restless hands. Ellen held Isolde close, the red thread hidden beneath her sleeve. By the week's end, the girl had not been found. In the growing silence, work continued. The harvest would not wait, not even for sorrow. The fields shimmered under the sun, their heat rising in lazy veils. Ellen joined the other women in binding the sheaves, her back aching by midday, her arms streaked with dust and sweat. Isolde remained in the shade with her grandmother, gumming a wooden ring and babbling to the wind. Godefroy sang while he worked, not loudly, just under his breath, old songs in a language no one remembered, passed from fathers to sons like seeds. Ellen liked his voice best when he didn't know she was listening. One evening, as they rested near the well, Godefroy turned to her and asked, "What did you think your life would be like?" It was not the sort of question people asked. Not here, not now. Dreams were a luxury. But Ellen thought for a while and said, "I thought I'd grow old in my father's house, spinning wool until my eyes failed. I never thought I'd have a child before I was 15, or that I'd love her so fiercely it would frighten me." Godefroy looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the half-light. "I didn't think I'd love you. I didn't think I'd be the kind of man who could." She reached for his hand. It was rough, dirt beneath every nail, a blister blooming near his thumb. But it was warm. It was steady. "I'm glad you are," she said. In the weeks that followed, the missing girl was spoken of less and less. The villagers, as they always did, folded grief into their daily labor. The harvest was good, the barley golden and heavy, bread baked well, chickens laid often. Still, Ellen never untied the red thread. She told Isolde stories before sleep, gentle ones, about animals that talked and stars that sang. But sometimes, when the wind shifted, she would sing something older. A chant with no known words, just sounds that had lived in her bones since she was a child. Isolde would fall asleep with her tiny hand curled into Ellen's collar, her breath soft against her skin. One night, under a sky full of clear stars, Ellen woke to the sound of the door creaking open. Godefroy was still beside her, asleep. The fire had burned low. She rose slowly, heart pounding, and stepped barefoot across the floor. The door was ajar. She opened it fully and found nothing, just the wind, the moon, and in the dirt, a footprint, small, bare, pointing toward the woods. She closed the door quietly, locked it with the iron latch. Then she returned to her bed and curled around her daughter. The red thread remained. And in the rafters, the blue ribbon stirred. The wind changed again in early autumn, bringing with it a scent of apples gone soft and leaves turning brittle on the branch. It swept through Leofum like a silent herald, curling into corners, stirring cloaks and loosening shutters that had not creaked all summer. The villagers took no notice, as they always did, not with words, but with small gestures. The hanging of sprigs above doorways, the murmuring of half-remembered prayers, and the closing of windows earlier each evening. Ellen noticed it most when she stood alone. There was a peculiar stillness just after dusk, not quiet, but empty, as if the sounds that should have been there had simply chosen not to appear. Even the insects hushed their usual chorus. Isolde, now nearly walking, had begun to wake during those hours, eyes wide, lips trembling, reaching toward the corner of the room as though someone stood there just out of sight. "She sees things," Nanwith said simply when Ellen told her. "Babies always do. They haven't been told not to yet." Ellen said nothing. But that evening, she placed Salt along the windowsill and whispered Isolde's name 3 times before tucking her into the cradle. Despite the unease threading its way through the air, the rhythm of village life continued. The barley had been cut, the rye gathered, turnips were pulled from the ground in long rows, their skins caked in earth, their scent sharp. Ellen helped dig, her hands raw beneath the nails. Isolde sat beside the field with a cloth doll and a crust of bread, babbling to herself and drawing in the dust with a stick. At the edge of the field stood the woods, always watching. Ellen had not gone near them since the night she found the footprint. She told no one, but each time the wind blew from that direction, she would glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the pale girl with the blue ribbon emerge from between the trees. The ribbon still lay hidden in the rafters. It was Godefroy who found the second one. He came in one evening, pale and shaking, holding it in his hand. A ribbon, green this time, of the same fine silk. He discovered it looped around the neck of their cow, tied in a neat bow. The cow was unharmed, just quiet, more quiet than usual. It wouldn't eat. Ellen stared at the ribbon for a long time before taking it from him. She said nothing. She didn't want to frighten him, but something within her stomach coiled. She took both ribbons, blue and green, and wrapped them in wool, then buried them beneath the hearthstone while Isolde napped. That night, the child cried for hours. Not screaming, not in pain, just crying. A slow, mournful sound, like a song being sung through water. Godefroy rocked her until his arms ached, and Ellen hummed until her throat burned. Nothing soothed her. When sleep finally came, it was dawn, and with dawn came mist. Not the usual autumn fog that curled along the ground, but a dense wall of whiteness that swallowed the village. Sound disappeared inside it. Ellen stepped outside that morning and could not see her own fence. She heard the bell from the chapel ring once, then again. A call. The villagers gathered like ghosts in the square, their cloaks damp, eyes red from sleeplessness. Something had happened. A boy had vanished, 10 years old, last seen near the path to the woods where he'd gone to collect kindling for his mother. His bundle of sticks was found in a pile, carefully laid as if someone had taken great care. But no sign of the boy. Panic swept through Leotham, quiet panic, the kind that spreads behind the eyes, the kind that tightens throats and silences laughter. Father Edric declared another fast, but this time, Nanwith said otherwise. No fasting, she told Ellen as they packed dried herbs in cloth bundles. Not now. You don't starve the body when the spirit's thin. You feed it, you warm it, you anchor it. And so Ellen baked, bread, thick and crusty with caraway and honey. She left a small loaf near the hearth beside a cup of milk and a pinch of salt. A gift, not a sacrifice. Others in the village followed suit, bits of food left on windowsills, tiny wreaths hung from fence posts. No one called it what it was, but everyone knew. The old ways, surfacing again. Ellen sang more often to Isolde, songs she barely remembered learning, lullabies in strange scales with no known beginning or end. Isolde calmed when she heard them. Her tiny hand would rest against Ellen's chest, fingers flexing softly, as if remembering something from a place before birth. Then one evening, the third ribbon appeared, red this time, tied to the latch of their door. It shimmered slightly in the dusk light, as if it had been placed there just moments before. Godefroy found it first. He didn't touch it, just stood there, staring. Ellen untied it slowly, her breath held, her hands cold. She didn't bury this one. She burned it. In the fire, it curled into itself, turning black and then vanishing in a gust of smoke that smelled faintly, unmistakably of roses. That night, she did not sleep. She watched Isolde, watched the window, listened to the wind. And in the deepest part of night, she heard it. A knock, not loud, barely there, but a knock 3 times on the wooden door. She rose, slowly. Her heart was a drum. She reached for the iron rod Godefroy kept beside the hearth. She stood before the door, bare feet on the cold floor, and waited. The knock did not come again. Instead, silence, then footsteps, soft, retreating. She didn't open the door. Not then. She waited until morning, when the light began to lift the sky from gray to pale blue. When she stepped outside, the mist was gone. The world was clear again, and in the dirt by the threshold, bare footprints, tiny, one set, pointing toward the woods. Ellen stood barefoot at the threshold, the cold seeping through the stone and into the arches of her feet. The prints were still damp in the earth, tiny, perfect impressions of toes and soles, so delicate they might have belonged to a child not more than 4 or 5 years old. Yet they were too neat, too deliberate, as though placed, not walked. Godefroy came to stand beside her, silent. He carried Isolde in his arms, wrapped tight in her woolen blanket, still sleeping. Neither of them spoke. A wind came then, soft and dry, brushing past them like breath from unseen lips. It stirred the leaves piled near the corner of the house and tugged at the edges of Ellen's shawl. When it passed, the silence returned, heavier than before. They did not follow the prints. Instead, Godefroy fetched a spade and quietly turned the earth beside them, erasing the path back toward the forest. Ellen swept the threshold. Then inside, they washed Isolde's hands and feet with milk and salt, whispering over her in a rhythm that came not from words but memory. Nanwith arrived before noon. The old woman entered without knocking, brushing past the doorway like smoke. She held a sprig of juniper in one hand, and in the other, a pouch made of crow feathers tied with sinew, She placed it on the hearth without explanation. "This will keep what's outside, outside," she said, her voice low, hoarse from age and disuse. "But only if the house stays still. Don't let strangers cross your floor, not for a while." Ellen nodded. "We won't." Nanwit's eyes found the cradle. Isolde was awake now, her dark eyes blinking solemnly in the dim light. The old woman leaned close. "She sees," she whispered, almost to herself. "Still open. Most close by now, but not her. She'll keep seeing, best she learns how." Then she stood straight again and handed Ellen a bundle wrapped in cloth. Thorns, ash bark, and something small and bone-white Ellen chose not to unwrap. "Burn one piece each night," Nanwith said, "until the moon is full again. Then bury what's left." "What if more children go missing?" Ellen asked quietly. Nanwith looked at her with an expression neither gentle nor cruel. "They will." And she left. That night, Ellen burned the first bundle. The smoke curled in strange shapes, sharp at first, then soft, smelling of peat, salt, and something older. Isolde did not cry. She watched the flames as though listening to something Ellen could not hear. Godefroy said little that evening. He stared at the door, at the shutters, at the cradle. "I don't know what to do," he said once. "Neither do I," Ellen replied, "but we'll do it together." Days passed. The village did not speak of the footprints, but everyone knew. They carried their silence like heavy baskets. No one let their children wander. Mothers clutched little hands as tightly as scythes. Fathers walked the edges of fields with staffs, their eyes on the tree line. Another ribbon was found in the next village. This one was white, tied around the horn of a sleeping ox. The animal awoke unharmed but refused to move for 2 days. Its eyes leaked tears. Then came the news. The missing boy, the 10-year-old from before, had returned. He was found at the chapel doorstep, barefoot, hair full of leaves. He said nothing, just sat blinking in the light. When asked where he'd been, he gave no answer. Ellen heard it from Godefroy, who'd gone to the square. She asked if the boy was changed. "Yes," he said, "but not in a way I can name." That night, Isolde laughed in her sleep. Ellen sat beside her, watching. The fire was low, the shadows long, and though the windows were closed and the shutters latched, she could feel something watching from the other side, not close but aware, like a candle flame in distant fog. She held her daughter tightly. The next morning, Godefroy returned from the southern pasture with something wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table with a look Ellen recognized, a mix of dread and duty. She unwrapped it slowly. Another ribbon, black silk, frayed at the ends. It had been tied around the gatepost leading into their pasture. Beneath it in the earth was a perfect circle of stones, not scattered, placed, a ring no wider than a hand's span. Inside it, a single clump of pale, unfamiliar moss. Ellen said nothing. She took the ribbon and placed it with the others. Then she ground salt and bone ash in a mortar and spread it around the doorstep. Isolde began speaking that week. Her first word was not mother, nor father. It was something else, soft, lilting, in no language Ellen recognized. But the way she said it, like a prayer or a song, made the hair rise on Ellen's arms. She repeated it often, looking at corners, at shadows, at the flicker of firelight. Ellen never repeated the word aloud. The other children in the village stopped playing at the edge of the fields. They stayed near their homes, watched by wary eyes. Fathers walked them to chapel. Mothers no longer washed clothes alone at the stream. And still, no one spoke of the ribbons. But in the evenings, from beyond the woods, faint music sometimes drifted across the fields. Not flute, not drum, something stranger, twisting, lulling, threaded with harmonies that made the teeth ache and the eyes water. Ellen heard it only once, and only for a moment. She covered Isolde's ears. Autumn deepened. Leaves withered into gold and crimson, falling like coins into the mud. The days grew shorter, the wind colder. The villagers prepared for winter with hands that worked faster, eyes that stayed on the horizon. And still, the woods watched. On the final night before Samhain, when the veil was believed thinnest, Ellen tied a new red thread around Isolde's wrist and drew a circle in ash around her cradle. She placed 3 iron nails in the corners of the room and burned the last of Nanwit's bundles. She did not sleep, neither did Isolde. Together, in the low orange glow of the dying fire, they listened, to the wind, to the silence, to the faint sound of footsteps that never quite reached the door. The morning after Samhain dawned gray and brittle. Frost clung to the eaves like breath caught in a sigh. and the ground, once soft with autumn's rot, had hardened under the cold. Leopham lay hushed, its lanes empty save for smoke rising from hearts, straight and still, as though the air itself dared not move. Ellen rose with Isolde already in her arms, both having slept only in snatches, their dreams frayed by the memory of footsteps that never came near, but never turned away. The ash circle drawn the night before still ringed the cradle, smudged but unbroken. The nails glinted in their places. Nothing had come through, and yet Ellen knew something had come close. Godefroy was already up, tending the fire. He said little, his face drawn and quiet. He brought Ellen a cup of nettle tea and kissed the crown of Isolde's head before stepping outside to check the animals. They had begun this ritual without words. Protect, provide, love was folded within it, unspoken but constant. Ellen moved through the morning slowly. Every creak of the timber, every shift in the wind outside, kept her ears pricked, her body taut like a bowstring. She had lived her whole life among stories, whispered tales of spirits, tokens, and paths that led nowhere and never back. But now those tales moved close enough to breathe upon her. Later that day, while the village gathered at the chapel for the post-Samhain blessing, Ellen walked to the edge of the woods. She left Isolde with her mother, who clucked and fretted, but did not argue. Only for a moment, Ellen said, "I need to see." The trees stood in their familiar quiet, black-limbed and bare, with patches of old moss glowing faintly in the thinning light. The path into the forest was narrow, marked only by the absence of bramble. Ellen did not step forward, she merely looked. Something about the trees, the way they leaned as if listening, made her breath catch, and then she saw it, a circle. Not of stones this time, but of mushrooms, small and pale, glistening like dew-kissed teeth. They ringed a patch of earth where the leaves had been swept clean, though no wind had blown that morning. A fairy ring. She stepped back immediately, her pulse skittering in her chest. She'd heard of such things. Everyone had. Places you did not enter, places that were not entirely in this world. Even looking too long invites notice, Nanwith once said. Ellen turned and walked back to the village, her footsteps fast and measured, never once breaking into a run. She knew better than to run. That showed fear, and fear was a kind of beacon. When she returned, she found Isolde staring at the window again, her mouth forming that strange word, the one Ellen still had not dared repeat. That evening, after Godefroy had returned from his rounds and the fire was stoked once more, Ellen told him what she'd seen. He listened with eyes that did not blink. Then, after a long silence, he said, "I dreamed of a circle, last week, a ring of stones near the well, and I was standing inside it, holding something alive, but it wasn't Isolde." Ellen's skin prickled. "Did you step into it?" she asked. "In the dream?" "Yes." Ellen didn't speak for a long time. She simply reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were cold. The next day, the first snow fell. Thin, patchy, soft. Not the heavy cloaking snows of deepest winter, but the beginning. It dusted the rooftops, settled in the hollows of boots, and painted the world in a kind of hush that was both beautiful and ominous. The villagers stayed indoors more. Doors were barred earlier. Fires were kept higher. The woods became a blur behind veils of white. And Isolde changed. She began walking, small, wobbling steps, her arms outstretched like a bird learning its wings. Her laughter rang through the cottage like bells, sudden and sweet. But sometimes in the moments between, she stared at nothing. Not a dazed gaze, not a child's wonder, a fixed look, as if someone had spoken. One morning, Ellen caught her lifting her hand toward the wall, her fingers curling as if around another. When asked what she was doing, Isolde replied in her babbled way, "Playing." "With whom?" "Her," she said. "The one with no shoes." Ellen's blood turned to ice. That night, she went to Nanwith's cottage. The old woman lived at the far edge of the village, beyond the last fence, where even dogs did not linger long. Her windows were fogged with herbs. Smoke poured in strange colors from her chimney. When Ellen told her about the dream, the ribbon, the fairy ring, and now Isolde's invisible playmate, Nanwith nodded slowly, as though none of it surprised her. "They've taken notice," she said. "Something has. You're marked now." Ellen asked, "Why us?" Nanwith stirred something in a bowl, roots, stones, scraps of something darker. "Not all attention is earned. Sometimes it's inherited. Sometimes it's stumbled upon. Can we stop it?" Nanwith looked at her for a long time, then said, You can prepare, you can delay, but stop it. No, not entirely. She gave Ellen a charm, a small disc of carved bone tied with hair. Hang it above her bed. Never let it fall. If it does, bury it where she first cried. Ellen returned home in silence. The snow was deeper now, muffling her steps. The sky had turned the color of iron. Inside, she found Isolde asleep in Godefroy's arms, her tiny hand resting on his chest. The fire crackled. The room smelled of cloves and old wool. Ellen hung the charm. Then she watched and waited. For what? She did not know. But whatever it was, it had already begun. The snow deepened. By midwinter, the village of Leofum seemed wrapped in silence, not just the hush of frozen earth or muffled footfalls, but a deeper stillness, one that pressed against the bones. The thatched roofs wore thick caps of white, smoke from hearths coiled low and slow, and no one lingered outdoors unless work demanded it. The chapel bell tolled more often now, but it rang softer, as if even sound had grown wary of calling attention to itself. Inside the cottage, the fire burned longer each night. Ellen had grown meticulous with her preparations. Each morning she checked the charm Nanwith had given her, ensuring the carved bone disc still hung where she tied it above Isolde's bed. It had not fallen, yet. Isolde's sleeping had changed. Not worse, not better, just different. She rarely stirred. She no longer cried at night, and when she dreamt, her lips moved silently, as if whispering answers to questions no one else had asked. One morning, Ellen found her sitting up, smiling faintly, and staring at the hearth. "What is it?" Ellen asked, kneeling beside her. Isolde didn't look away. "She was singing," she said softly. "Who was?" "The girl. She sings when the fire is low." Ellen felt a chill crawl through her, despite the warmth of the flames. She reached forward, stirred the embers higher, and said no more. Later that day, Godefroy returned early from the woods. He had gone to cut branches for firewood, but had brought back nothing. His face was pale, lips dry, eyes wide and unfocused. Ellen met him at the door. "What happened? There's a tree," he said. "It wasn't there before." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "In the clearing past the old well. I've passed that place every season since I could walk. But now there's a tree. Not tall, not dead, just wrong." She waited. "It has ribbons tied to it," he whispered. Her stomach tightened. "How many?" she asked. He shook his head. "Too many to count, hanging from every branch, and at its roots a child's shoe. Just one." That night they did not speak. They ate in silence. Isolde watched them both with calm eyes, as if she already knew. She had taken to sitting near the hearth, not playing, not babbling, simply watching the fire as though waiting for it to say something. Ellen kept the shutters closed tightly. Each morning, a new bundle of ash and herbs was burned. Each evening, a fresh circle of crushed rosemary was drawn around the threshold. Salt was poured across every windowsill. The smell of it filled the air, sharp and clean, but never comforting. On the third morning after Godefroy's discovery, Ellen noticed the charm had turned. Not fallen, but twisted. The carved bone now faced the wall, its surface hidden. The thread had not broken. No breeze had stirred the air. The shift was deliberate. She did not touch it. Instead, she fetched a bowl of milk and placed it beneath the window. Beside it, she left a honey cake, not fresh, not warm, but carefully wrapped in linen. Offerings, please. That night, the wind howled. Not a storm, no snow came, but the wind spoke in tones like language. It pushed against the shutters with knuckles of air, whistled down the chimney like a breath drawn through teeth. Godefroy stood with his axe in hand. Ellen held Isolde close to her chest, whispering her name over and over like a prayer. Then silence. No wind, no sound, not even the fire crackling. Isolde lifted her head. Her eyes turned to the door. "She's here," she said. Ellen froze. Her arms tightened. Isolde looked toward the latch. "She's cold." The silence stretched. Godefroy moved slowly, setting down the axe, stepping forward, hand outstretched as if to touch the air itself. "Don't," Ellen whispered. Then 3 soft knocks on the door. Not loud, not urgent, just present. Godefroy stopped. The fire, dim moments before, flared high. The milk bowl shattered without being touched. The charm above the cradle spun again, once, then stilled. And then the knock came again, this time at the window. A gentle tap. Ellen did not move. She held Isolde close, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would shake the rafters. The knock came once more, then nothing. Not silence, absence. Whatever had been there was gone. She waited until the fire dimmed again before moving. Godefroy opened the shutters a crack, just enough to see. There, resting on the outside sill, lay another ribbon. This one was silver. It shimmered like moonlight, untouched by snow or frost. No footprints marked the path to the window. Just the ribbon, tied in a perfect bow, and a single strand of hair, pale gold, caught beneath the knot. Ellen took it and placed it with the others. She no longer burned them. She no longer buried them. They were not messages to be silenced. They were a record, a tally. The next morning, Isolde did not speak. She did not walk. She sat near the hearth, staring at the fire, humming a tune that did not belong to anything Ellen had ever sung. And when she reached for her doll, she called it a name Ellen had never taught her, a name she did not repeat. Outside, the snow fell again, but softer, almost gently, as if it too was listening. The days that followed moved with the strange, measured quiet of a world holding its breath. In Leopham, the snow continued to fall, not in storms or flurries, but in a constant, patient sift, as if the sky itself was watching, waiting, and whispering as it blanketed the earth. Ellen no longer counted time in days, nor marked them by the chapel bell. Instead, she counted ribbons. There were 6 now. Blue, green, red, black, silver. Each one found, not given. Each one left in silence. Each one carrying with it a presence, not yet seen, but increasingly felt. In the walls, in the windows, in the hush between footsteps. Isolde had grown even quieter. She did not cry. She barely laughed. But she watched everything. Her eyes followed the flicker of candlelight and traced the movement of shadows with a focus far too deep for her small years. She would often sit in her cradle or near the hearth and hum to herself, tunes that curled and twisted, melodies half-formed, too old for lullabies. Sometimes she murmured words under her breath, not in play, not in gibberish, but as if reciting something long rehearsed. Ellen listened. She never interrupted. One morning, Godefroy returned from chopping wood, his cheeks pink from cold, his breath clouding in the air. He was carrying something beneath his cloak. It was hanging from the gatepost again, he said, laying it gently on the table. Not a ribbon this time, a doll. Rag-made with a face stitched in black thread and hair made from what looked like twisted flax. Its body was limp but clean, no mud, no snow. Around its neck was a loop of thin golden thread, and stitched into the hem of its dress were 5 shapes: a crescent, a hand, a spiral, an eye, and a single vertical line. Ellen stared at it, a tightness forming in her chest. Isolde, without prompting, reached toward the doll and said, "Her name is Moss." Ellen felt her breath catch. "Who told you that?" Isolde blinked, then looked toward the corner of the room, just beyond the fire's reach. She did. They burned the doll that evening. Not in the hearth, but outside, behind the house, in a pit Godefroy dug with shaking hands. They did not speak. They did not sing. They lit the fire with dried pine and watched until nothing remained but ash and thread. When they returned inside, Isolde was asleep in her cradle. The charm above her bed had fallen. Ellen picked it up, slowly, as if it might bite. The bone disc was split down the center. A clean break, no splintering. The thread had unraveled in 3 places, the knot loose and open like a mouth. She buried it before dawn. And in its place she hung a new charm, one of her own making. A circle of rowan twigs bound with red-dyed wool, knotted 13 times and woven through with her own hair. She whispered her daughter's name into it. 7 times. In the dark, she did not know if it would help, but she had to try. Winter pressed on. The river froze, the roads vanished beneath snowdrifts, and the chapel stood silent for 3 Sundays in a row. Father Edric was ill. Some said it was the cold. Others, in softer tones, said he'd seen something, that he'd gone walking late one evening to clear his thoughts and returned with white hair and a tongue that no longer spoke. Nanwood came to see him. Afterward, she said nothing to anyone, but she left a bowl of water and a stone wrapped in wool outside his door. Ellen watched the stone disappear the next morning. The villagers began to gather more closely now, not for gossip, not for prayer, but for presence. Fear breeds proximity. They spoke in lowered voices, exchanged bread more often, and left offerings by the chapel steps: milk, honey, iron nails, feathers. One woman, Mora, the miller's wife, claimed to have seen a figure standing in the fields at dawn. Not a man, not a child, something tall and thin, wrapped in gray. "It watched me," she said, "and it bowed." She wept as she told it. The next night, her baby cried until morning. then didn't cry at all for 3 days. Ellen heard the crying. She stayed awake beside Isolde, holding her close, her eyes never straying from the window. Snow collected on the sill like the edge of sleep. Then, on the 7th night of the season's longest stretch, Ellen awoke to a sound. Not the knock, not the wind. A voice, soft, clear, female, singing. It came from just beyond the door, low, sweet, and wordless like a lullaby sung by someone long dead. Ellen did not rise. She lay frozen, her breath shallow, her hand gripping Isolde beneath the blankets. The fire had gone out. Only embers glowed faintly in the dark, and the song continued. Godefroy stirred, but did not wake. Ellen listened. The voice changed, deepened slightly. The melody began again. The same tune, slower now, like something remembered from far away, from another cradle, another room, another time, and then silence. No footsteps, no wind, no departure, just silence. In the morning, she opened the door. There was no snow on the step, no new ribbon. But hanging from the branch above the door was a single child's mitten, wool brown and far too small for Isolde. Inside it, tucked tightly, was a folded scrap of parchment. On it, written in tiny looping script, was a single line. She is almost ready. Ellen didn't speak of it to Godefroy. She placed the mitten in the hearth and watched it burn. But she kept the parchment, folded, silent, and hidden, just like the fear that was beginning to grow inside her, slow and steady, like ice beneath a frozen lake. The cold tightened its grip as the final days of the year crept onward. The world seemed paused beneath the weight of snow, as though even time itself had grown reluctant to pass. In Leopham, candles burned longer in every window, not out of celebration, but out of caution, as if light itself might push back the hush that gathered too close after sunset. Ellen no longer waited for signs. They came whether she watched or not. The parchment, with its chilling message, "She is almost ready," remained hidden beneath the flagstone beneath her bed. She'd folded it 3 times, then wrapped it in linen, but still, she dreamt of it most nights. The words bloomed in her sleep like frost across glass, legible even in darkness. Isolde grew. She moved with more certainty now, walking with a quiet grace, never tumbling, never faltering. At times, Ellen found herself watching her daughter as if she were someone else's child, someone older, stranger, born of stories and wind rather than blood. And yet she loved her fiercely. More fiercely, perhaps, because of the fear that bloomed in the corners of that love, the knowledge that something beyond Ellen's reach had also taken notice. That something had its eye on Isolde, had from the start. Godefroy noticed too. He spoke less. His shoulders had taken on a tightness, his gaze often fixed on the horizon as if expecting riders or lightning or worse. He stayed close to the house, chopped more wood than they needed, and hammered iron nails into the door frame without explanation. Ellen did not ask. The village too had changed. Leopham had always been close-knit, bound by work and season, not affection. But now there was something deeper holding it together. Not warmth, but wariness. A mutual understanding that something moved through their world now with quiet steps and listening eyes. Fewer voices laughed. The songs sung at the hearths were older, sadder, heavy with chords that bent in strange places. One morning, while Ellen hung clothes to dry by the fire, Isolde pointed to the window and said, "They're waiting again." Ellen froze. "Who's waiting?" Isolde didn't turn her head. "The ones near the trees, the tall ones." Ellen walked to the window. Only snow, only silence. But the trees stood closer than they had the week before. Not in distance, but in presence. Their bare limbs pressed against the sky like inked hands on parchment. And in the spaces between them, shadows moved too slowly for the wind alone. Ellen turned away and pulled Isolde to her chest. "No looking," she said gently. "Not when they wait." That night she dreamt. In the dream, she stood barefoot in the snow outside the cottage. A figure waited at the edge of the woods, tall, cloaked, faceless. Isolde was in her arms, sleeping. The figure raised a hand, not in greeting, in invitation. Ellen felt her feet moving, slow and soundless, not against her will, but as if her will no longer mattered. Just as she reached the ring of trees, Isolde opened her eyes and whispered something in her ear, a single word Ellen could not remember upon waking, but its sound lingered in her ears for hours, like smoke. She did not speak of the dream. Instead, she fetched her mother's old prayer book from the chest beneath the bed. She hadn't opened it since her wedding. Its pages were yellowed, fragile, filled with both Latin scripture and margin notes written in her grandmother's slanted hand. Old charms, hybrid verses, the prayers of a generation that feared God but trusted their bones more. She found one for binding, one for stillness, and one for forgetting. Ellen copied them onto scraps of cloth and sewed them into the hem of Isolde's cloak, each stitch pulled tight, her hands trembling, her mouth repeating Isolde's name like a beat. When she finished, she pressed her lips to the fabric. "I'll keep you," she whispered. "Whatever comes, I'll keep you." The next day brought a visitor, rare in that season. A rider from the south, hooded and pale, led a donkey heavy with parcels. He claimed to be a tinker, selling needles, buckles, salt, and trinkets. But his voice was hollow and too smooth, and his eyes never blinked. He came to the door just as the sun dipped low behind the trees. Ellen opened it only a crack. He smiled with his lips, not his eyes. "Evening to you, mistress. Fine house, warm smell. May I step in?" "No," she said quickly, the word like a blade. "What do you want?" "Only to trade," he said. "Something for the little one." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a carved wooden rattle, beautiful, detailed, shaped like a rose in full bloom with tiny bells hidden in the petals. "No payment," he said. "A gift." Ellen didn't move. Behind her, Isolde stepped into the room, silent as ever. She saw the man, the rattle, and she smiled. "Don't take it," Ellen said sharply. The smile faded. The man tilted his head. "She remembers it, I think. From before." Ellen slammed the door. The latch caught. Outside, there was no footfall, no retreat, only the sound of something soft being placed against the wood. She waited until full dark before opening it again. The rattle lay on the threshold. She did not touch it. Instead, she fetched the iron tongs from the hearth, lifted it carefully, and dropped it into the fire. It burned with a strange, sweet scent, like honey, like resin, and when it cracked, it let out a single bell-like chime. That night, Isolde cried for the first time in weeks, a low, heart-deep sob, as though mourning something she could not name. Ellen rocked her until sleep returned, and as she did, she whispered again, "I'll keep you, whatever it takes." The snow no longer fell as often, but the cold deepened in its absence, becoming sharper, a biting presence that sank into the wood of the houses, into the joints of the old, into the marrow of the land. Ice webbed across the creek, thin and glistening like spun glass. The village of Leofum grew stiller by the day, as though the world itself was bracing for something unnamed. The rattle had burned to nothing. Not even ash remained. But that night, after the final ember winked out, Ellen discovered a new mark above the door. 3 lines carved into the lintel, thin, precise, deliberate. She called for Godefroy. He studied them under candlelight, his breath fogging in the cold air that always seemed to slip into the house after dark, no matter how tight the shutters were drawn. "Could have been the wind," he said, not believing it. "Could have been nothing," he added, not believing that either. They did not speak of it again. But the next morning, Ellen rose early and began mixing clay and ash. She pressed it into the marks, smoothing it with careful fingers. When it dried, she scraped fresh soot from the hearth and painted a cross over the sealed lines. Not a holy cross. Not entirely. It was a shape older than the chapel, older than books. One she had seen once in her grandmother's locket. Isolde watched her, quiet, a thumb in her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking. Afterward, Ellen drew a basin of warm water, added thyme and lavender, and bathed her daughter as if it were a ritual. She sang not to soothe, but to strengthen. Low, steady melodies passed down in whispers. Later that day, the sky turned strange. The clouds above Leofum thickened not in gray, but in colorless shadow, like smoke without flame. The light dimmed unnaturally early, casting the village into an early dusk. A dog barked once, then fell silent. A single bird, a raven perhaps, circled above the trees before vanishing behind the black ridge. Nanwith appeared at Ellen's doorstep just after nightfall. She did not knock. She never did. Ellen opened the door before her hand touched the latch. The old woman's face was paler than usual. Not afraid, but wary, alert, like an animal who knows it is being hunted. "You saw it," she said without preamble. Ellen nodded. "The mark, yes. There will be more." Nanwith stepped inside and laid a bundle of dry leaves on the table, then a pouch of iron filings. She brought with her the smell of wet bark and old roots, the forest clinging to her like a shawl. "I've been watching the hills," she said. "They're shifting." "What does that mean?" It means the edges are changing, the lines between things. The places where they walk aren't where they used to be. Godefroy, who had been sharpening his knife at the table, looked up. They're getting closer. Nanwith didn't nod, didn't need to. Ellen asked the question that had lived in her throat for weeks now. What do they want with her? Nanwith looked at Isolde, then back. Not to harm her, she said. Not in the way we think of harm, but she is noticed. And once noticed, a child becomes a thread. A thread? A bridge between worlds. She sees more than she should, feels more. That makes her a beacon, and a beacon draws those who've forgotten how to sleep. Ellen wrapped her arms around Isolde. Can we hide her? Nanwith shook her head. No, but you can anchor her. You can make her heavy with this world. Keep her close to blood, to warmth, to names. She pressed a small jar into Ellen's hand. Inside were tiny beads of something golden. Amber from the coast, old. Hold it against her skin when she sleeps. It will remind her where she belongs. Before leaving, Nanwith paused at the door. There may come a night, she said, when she answers someone you cannot see, when she tries to go to them. Ellen's grip tightened around her daughter. When that night comes, Nanwith said, don't call her by name, not once, not until dawn. Then she left. The door clicked softly behind her. That night, Ellen barely slept. Isolde stirred often, not crying but murmuring, words without shape, syllables and patterns that made the candle flames flicker. At one point, near midnight, Ellen awoke to find her standing in the middle of the room, one hand outstretched as if someone had taken it. Ellen, Godefroy whispered, but Ellen shook her head and said nothing. She rose from the bed slowly, walked to her daughter, and pressed the amber bead gently to her chest. Isolde blinked, then blinked again, as if waking. She looked up. Mama? Ellen scooped her into her arms and carried her back to the warmth of the blankets. No further words were spoken. By morning, new footprints marked the snow outside the cottage. Small, bare. They circled the house once, then disappeared into nothing. No leading tracks, no return path, just a ring, as if something had walked around their home and vanished into air. Godefroy stared at them a long time. Then he fetched the hammer and nails again. Ellen began to burn bay leaves at every threshold. And in the cradle, Isolde slept with the amber pressed to her chest, her fingers curled tight around a lock of her mother's hair. They did not speak of the next ribbon. They simply waited for it. The ribbon arrived on the 13th day of frost. It was not tied to the door or window this time, not looped around the gate or hanging from the trees. It was found curled inside Isolde's blanket, warm from her body, nestled against her collarbone like something placed there with care and familiarity. This ribbon was gold, not threadbare, not frayed, but rich and gleaming, woven with such fineness that it shimmered even in the dim candlelight. It bore no scent, no dirt, no mark of travel, as though it had always belonged there. Ellen found it just after dawn. She did not scream. She did not call for Godefroy. Instead, she stood motionless at the cradle, staring at the strip of gold silk as it lay curled against her daughter's skin. Isolde was asleep still, her cheeks flushed with warmth, a small smile tugging faintly at her mouth. Ellen reached out and lifted the ribbon by its edge, careful not to wake her. It was soft, impossibly soft, and oddly warm, as if it had just been drawn from the sun itself. She did not burn this one, not yet. She wrapped it tightly and sealed it in a clay pot, placing it beside the other hidden things under the bed. The folded parchment, the fragments of Nanwith's broken charm, and the last of the rowan ash she'd saved from the fall. When Godefroy returned from the stable that morning, she told him. He said nothing at first. Then quietly, it was 13 days since the last. Ellen nodded. We should leave, he said. Take her, go east or south. And where would we go, she asked. This doesn't live only here. We were chosen, not surrounded. He sat at the table, head in his hands. Then what do we do? Ellen answered without hesitation. We root her deeper. That day they began the bindings, not of ropes or charms, but of memory, of presence. Ellen and Godefroy worked as if laying a foundation, stitching her daughter into the world with every gesture, every moment. They carved her name into the lintel above the hearth. They pressed her bare feet into flour-dusted boards and traced the outlines in charcoal. They made a meal with only food grown within Leofum's borders, barley, turnip, lamb, and fed it to her with their hands, speaking her name between each bite. They braided a lock of Ellen's hair into Isolde's, and when night came, they kept her between them, each with a hand resting lightly over her heart. "You belong here," Ellen whispered. "You are ours." The wind howled that night, harder than before. The house creaked and groaned as if resisting pressure from without, as if something leaned against it with deliberate weight. A cup fell from the shelf. The iron hook on the door trembled, though no one touched it. And far beyond the window, from somewhere deep within the woods, a sound rose. Not music, not quite, but like the memory of it. Notes half heard, half remembered, winding through the trees like thread through fabric. Isolde opened her eyes. She looked toward the door. Ellen sat upright. Godefroy reached for the hearth poker without rising. The latch did not lift. But the wind changed. It stopped pushing and began circling, a spiral of air around the house, a pull, not a shove. The smoke from the fire twisted unnaturally, curling in place before rising straight into the beams. Then came the voice, just one, a child's. Not Isolde's. Not any voice Ellen had ever heard in waking life. It spoke her name. Once. Ellen, clear as glass, soft as breath. She did not respond, not even to whisper. Beside her, Isolde turned her face to the wall, eyes wide but calm. The voice came again, this time from beneath the floorboards, curling up through the very bones of the house. Then, laughter. A child's laughter, not cruel, not loud, but ancient, knowing. The fire dimmed, the embers pulsed with a dull, reddish glow. Ellen reached out and pressed her palm to Isolde's chest. Godefroy placed his hand over both of theirs, and they waited. The laughter faded slowly, like smoke from a damp candle. The cold returned, sharper than before. The wind withdrew, and the house was silent. Morning came brittle and pale, a sky like bone, the frost etched into every surface. On the windowsill, inside the house, lay 13 small pebbles, white as teeth. They had not been there the night before. Each one was etched with a single line, forming no shape, no pattern, just 13 lines, one for each ribbon, one for each day. Ellen swept them into a cloth and placed them beside the golden silk. The count had begun, but the end had not been revealed. Not yet, not quite. The 13th pebble marked something. Ellen felt it in the air, though no one had said it aloud. The presence that had circled their home, that had whispered her name through the floorboards, had crossed a threshold. Not a door, not a wall, but a point of no return. The days grew harder after that. Snow returned in sheets, relentless and slow. It did not fall in flurries anymore, but settled from the sky like a shroud, wrapping everything in silence. The village of Leopham grew dim under it, as if the sun had forgotten where they lived. No birds returned, no tracks marred the roads. And still, Isolde slept. Not more, not less, just deeper. She no longer woke crying. But some mornings Ellen found her murmuring in her dreams, lips parted, brow calm, as though in conversation. Once Ellen pressed her ear close and caught a phrase, "Not yet, but soon." She whispered her daughter's name, but Isolde did not stir. That morning, Ellen went to Nanwith. She left Godefroy with Isolde and wrapped herself in a thick wool cloak, bones aching from fear more than cold. The path to the old woman's cottage wound through the northern edge of the village, past the smokehouse, past the chapel, now shuttered and locked, its bell fallen silent. Nanwith answered before Ellen knocked. "You feel it," she said. Ellen nodded. "There's a rhythm to them," Nanwith murmured. "A pattern. They move like breath, in and out, the ribbons, the laughter, the pebbles. That was their drawing in. The next will be the reach." "Reach for what?" Ellen asked. Nanwith didn't answer. She turned and moved to the hearth, stirring something thick and steaming in a pot. The smell of yew and bone filled the air. "They fed on notice," Nanwith said. "Fed on watching, on memory. Now they want acknowledgement. They want to be named." Ellen's throat tightened. "What happens if we do?" Nanwith looked at her with those eyes that had seen more than should be seen. Then the doorway opens, and it does not close again. She handed Ellen a bundle wrapped in waxed linen. "Thorns from the old border trees," she said. "Bled and cut during the frost moon. You must bury them under each corner of your home. Hammer one into the earth where Isolde took her first step." Ellen accepted them with hands that trembled. "Will it stop them?" "It will stall them," Nanwith said. "It will remind them that she is claimed, that she walks among named things." As Ellen turned to leave, the old woman reached for her wrist. "There is one more thing," she said. "On the night of the dark moon, when no light touches the sky, She must not be left alone. When is that? 3 nights from now. Ellen walked home in the thickening snow, her footprints vanishing behind her. She passed no one, not even the dogs barked. When she reached the house, she found Isolde staring into the fire again, her eyes darker than usual, her little hands folded over her lap as if in reverence. She did not look up when Ellen entered, but she spoke. 13 stones is the count before the gate. Ellen stopped in her tracks. What did you say? Isolde turned her head slowly. Before the gate opens, that's how they know you're listening. Ellen crossed the room and fell to her knees beside her. Who told you that? Isolde blinked, then said in a child's quiet voice, Moss. The name struck Ellen like cold water. Moss is gone, she said firmly. She was never yours. Isolde tilted her head. But I was hers. A little. Before I was yours. Ellen did not cry, but she held her daughter close for a long time. That night, Godefroy dug into the frozen ground. He buried the thorn bundles as instructed, hammering them into the corners until his knuckles bled. Ellen marked the place where Isolde had first stepped, near the hearth, just beside the cradle, and pressed the last thorn into the earth beneath the flagstone. No one slept well. On the second day, the wind returned, but it no longer came in gusts. It breathed, slowly, rhythmically, like lungs behind the walls. Godefroy heard scratching in the chimney, but found nothing there. Ellen discovered a line of water beneath the cradle, though no roof leak explained it, and that night the candles refused to stay lit. Each flame would sputter, then vanish, not with a gust, but as if snuffed between 2 unseen fingers. On the 3rd day, the day of the dark moon, Ellen did not let Isolde out of her arms. She cooked with one hand, bathed her while singing lullabies, fed her with measured spoonfuls, and whispered her name with every turn of the hour. Godefroy barred the windows and nailed shut the shutters. He salted the doors and laid iron tools across the sills. They hung rosemary in the rafters, and Ellen painted symbols in chalk over the thresholds, not from the chapel, but from the margins of her grandmother's old book, those with no Latin beside them. The sky dimmed early. By nightfall, it was black. Not merely dark, black, as though the stars themselves had fled. The fire burned bright, and they fed it with oak and rowan. The 3 of them huddled close, Ellen with Isolde wrapped in her arms, Godefroy sitting with the poker clutched like a weapon. Then came the knocking, but not at the door. It came from beneath the floor. 3 knocks, hollow, dull, then silence, then again 3 more, then a voice. Childlike, familiar, Isolde's own. Open, Mama. Ellen's mouth went dry. Let me in, I'm cold. Godefroy rose slowly, face pale, eyes fixed on the floorboards. Isolde stirred in Ellen's arms, but did not wake. The voice came again, softer, more pleading. Please, you forgot me. Ellen shut her eyes. No, she whispered. You're here, in my arms. You're already home. The fire flared suddenly. The knock stopped. Then from the far wall, a single breath, long and low, as if exhaled by the house itself. And silence. They stayed up until dawn, the fire burning to the last scrap of wood. When light finally touched the windows, Ellen rose, walked to the wall, and placed her ear against the cold timber. Nothing. Isolde slept peacefully, but across her cheek was a faint mark, a smear, like a single finger traced in ash. The mark did not wash off. Ellen tried gently, dipping a cloth in warm water infused with rosemary and salt, murmuring old blessings as she dabbed the ash-dark streak that curved like a crescent across Isolde's cheek. The child didn't stir, but her eyes fluttered beneath their lids, as if she were dreaming deeply, somewhere far beyond the reach of Ellen's voice. Godefroy stood nearby, arms crossed, staring at the mark with a clenched jaw. Could it be soot? He asked, though he already knew the answer. No, Ellen said, wringing out the cloth. It's not soot. It's not anything from here. By midday, the mark had faded, not erased, but sunken beneath the skin like an old memory. A shadow beneath the surface, visible only when the light struck her face a certain way. Ellen touched it once with her thumb, and Isolde sighed in her sleep, pressing her face into her mother's hand. They said nothing more about it. But that day, Ellen began to braid Isolde's hair with red thread, a new strand each morning. She tied sprigs of rue into the girl's clothing, left crushed acorns beneath her pillow, and scattered juniper needles in a ring around her cradle before dusk. Inside the cottage, everything became a ritual. Each footstep counted, each breath a measured thread in the fabric Ellen tried desperately to keep from unraveling. Outside, Leofum had become quieter still. The village paths, once trodden by laughter and market carts, now held only the hush of snow and the occasional track of a goat or a dog. Children no longer played beyond their doors. Even the adults moved as if under a spell, slow, cautious, eyes darting toward the woods without meaning to. Another child had gone missing. This time, it was a boy, 8 years old, last seen by the creek, chasing a red ribbon he claimed had danced just ahead of him, floating through the air like a butterfly. They found his boots side by side at the edge of the water, untouched by frost. No footprints, no drag marks, only the ribbon tied to a low branch of alder. This one was purple, deep, royal, glinting like wet ink. The boy's mother collapsed in the square when she heard. Her husband buried the boots beneath the chapel altar with trembling hands and wouldn't speak for 2 days. Father Edric still had not returned to sermon. The chapel door remained bolted. A crow sat perched on its steeple for 3 days straight, unmoving, even in the wind. Nanwith came to the family's house in silence and placed a stone at their door. Black, smooth, and heavy. She didn't speak a word, just touched the lintel with 2 fingers and turned away. Ellen watched it all from the edge. She no longer walked to the square, no longer traded bread or mended linens for neighbors. All that she was now lived in the hush between heartbeats inside that cottage, in Ysolte's breath, in the thin line of firelight that wrapped them like thread at night. On the 4th evening after the boy vanished, something new arrived. Not a ribbon, not a sound, but a smell. It came on the wind just after sunset, a low, curling sweetness that was not of any flower, nor spice, nor wood. It smelled of memory. Ellen froze where she stood, a bowl in her hands, her knees damp with the chill of the earth. The scent coiled around her like a shawl she had worn as a child, one she had forgotten until that moment. It smelled like the pine where she once fell asleep beside her sister, like the rosemary that had lined her wedding braid, like the river she'd bathed in when she was 10 and unafraid. It smelled of before, and it terrified her. She rose and moved quickly to the window. Outside, the snow glowed faintly beneath a clouded moon. The path to the trees was still. The fence stood. No shadows stirred, but the smell lingered. Ysolte stepped beside her, quiet as breath. "Mama," she said softly, "do you remember the hill with the white flowers?" Ellen looked down at her. "What hill?" "The one with the 3 stones, where we used to pick the petals and count the clouds." A coldness settled in Ellen's belly. "That place doesn't exist," she said. Ysolte smiled. "It does, but not here." That night, Ellen told Godefroy. They sat together by the fire long after Ysolte had fallen asleep, their hands clasped, foreheads nearly touching. The wind scraped against the shutters like claws drawn gently across wood. "She's beginning to speak of things I don't understand," Ellen whispered. "Memories that don't belong to her, or me." "She dreams of them," Godefroy said. "I've seen her lips move when she sleeps. Sometimes I hear my name, but she says it wrong." Ellen shivered. "She said something strange today," Godefroy added. "When I was dressing her, she looked at me and said, 'You're almost gone, but you haven't noticed yet.'" Ellen covered her mouth with her hand. Neither of them slept that night. They stayed beside Ysolte as she dreamed, their fingers resting against her arms, their eyes locked on the flutter of her lashes. In the stillness, she spoke again, not to them, but into the air. "They're not cruel," she murmured. "They just don't understand staying." Outside, the wind shifted, and with it came a voice, not speaking, not singing, but weeping. A soft, breathless sobbing that rose from the trees and curled around the corners of the cottage. It did not ask, it did not knock, it did not call, it simply wept. And with every sound, Ellen felt the floor beneath her sway, not as if the house moved, but as if the world itself was tilting gently, drawing them toward something. Toward a place where flowers grew in winter and children walked without leaving footprints. She held Ysolte closer and whispered the only thing she still believed. "You are mine. You are here." The weeping faded, but the smell of memory lingered. The weeping vanished with the dawn, but its presence lingered like the scent of something left too long near the fire, faint, ghostly, threaded through the quiet. When Ellen opened the door at first light, the snow outside bore no footprints, no indentations, not even the sweep of a breeze. It was as if the night had never touched the earth at all. Yet something had shifted. She could feel it in the bones of the house. The floor creaked where it never had before. The beams overhead groaned softly, not with the weight of snow, but as if reacting to something deeper, a tension in the air, a hush before a word is spoken. Isolde was different that morning. She sat by the hearth with her hands folded in her lap, not watching the flames, but the spaces between them, the flickers where no light stayed. She did not speak. But when Ellen brushed her hair, she felt a faint warmth beneath the girl's skin, as though she had been running, though she had not moved all night. Godefroy suggested they leave again. Just for a few days, he said. Even a night, a break in the rhythm. Maybe it will confuse them. But Ellen shook her head. They aren't following. They're waiting. Moving changes nothing. He didn't argue. But that afternoon, she found him sharpening his axe again, a rhythm too quick, too forceful, as though fighting something he could not name. By evening, clouds had swallowed the sun, casting the land into an early dusk. The snow turned gray, then blue, then nearly black beneath the weight of thickening sky. Ellen kept the candles lit, 5 in total, one for each corner of the room and one for the hearth. She had begun counting things more obsessively now. The number of breaths between Isolde's sighs, the number of sparks that leapt from the fire, the number of times the wind struck the shutters. She didn't know why, only that she must. As night fell, she noticed the smell again, not the sweetness from before. This was sharper, metallic, like rust on a blade, like wet stone in a deep place. It came through the cracks, through the walls. It settled in the back of her throat and made her eyes sting. Godefroy noticed it too. He stood from his chair abruptly, nose wrinkled, eyes darting. Something's near, he said. Then Isolde stood, without warning, without expression. She turned toward the door. Ellen, she said, not Mama, not Mother, but her name. Ellen's blood ran cold. Don't open it, she said, voice low. I wasn't going to, Isolde replied. She turned to face them both. Her face was calm, too calm. They're not outside tonight. Ellen stood slowly. Where are they? Isolde looked down at her feet. In the walls. Godefroy moved to the fire, grabbed the iron poker. Ellen scooped Isolde into her arms, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the rafters might echo it. A groan rose through the floorboards. Not wood against frost, but something deeper, like breath dragged through stone. The walls tightened, the light dimmed. Then came a scratching, soft at first like claws across bark, then louder, faster, like 1,000 tiny hands clawing inward. Ellen held Isolde tighter. What do they want? Isolde whispered to finish. The candles guttered, the hearth hissed, and then all at once, silence. The kind of silence that hurt the ears. That bent the air. That made even the fire seem still. Then came the whisper, not from the door, not from the chimney, from behind the cradle. Ellen turned her head slowly. There, pressed against the shadow, was a shape, small, childlike, curled into itself, not moving, not breathing. Ellen moved toward it with measured steps, Godefroy beside her. They crouched. The thing in the shadow was not Isolde, though it wore her shape. It was still, too still. Its skin was pale, gray-blue, its lips dark, but its eyes were open, and they watched Ellen without blinking. I am hers, it said. Ellen's hand flew to Isolde's chest. Her daughter was warm, breathing. The thing repeated, I am hers. I was left. I was forgotten. Godefroy raised the poker, but Ellen put a hand on his arm. No, she said, it wants recognition. The thing in the corner began to cry, not loudly, but with a wet, trembling sound like water dripping in a cave. I held her when she dreamed, it whispered. I kept her safe. I sang to her, and now she's leaving. Leaving where? Ellen asked. The thing did not answer. Instead, it dissolved. Not faded, dissolved, as though made of dust and breath. It crumbled into the air, drifting upward, vanishing into the beams. And in its place, a single ribbon. This one was white, not clean, not new, old, frayed, threadbare, wrapped tightly around a splinter of wood, a piece of Isolde's cradle. Ellen fell to her knees. Godefroy stepped back, his face pale. Isolde watched from the hearth unmoved. They're asking now, she said softly. No longer taking. That's worse. Outside, the snow began to fall again, but this time it fell in circles. Ellen stood and turned to the window. The snow was not random. It was swirling, inward, toward their home, as if the world itself had begun to spiral, as if everything, wind, snow, shadow, silence, was being drawn to a single point, and at the center of it was Isolde. Ellen pressed her hand to the glass and whispered, You stay, you stay. The swirling snow continued through the night. Not a blizzard, not a storm, but a deliberate rhythmic spiral, as though some unseen hand stirred the sky itself in long, looping strokes. The trees beyond the fields were barely visible, but their outlines seemed to lean inward now, bent not by wind, but by intention. Ellen barely moved from the window. Isolde had fallen asleep again, wrapped tightly in wool and silence, her body nestled between layers of fire-warm blankets. But even as her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of sleep, Ellen felt a distance between them, a space, a quiet fold in reality, where the girl's breath echoed from farther away than it should have. Godefroy didn't sit. He paced the cottage floor in slow, measured circles, one hand always grazing the walls, as if ensuring they were still solid. Neither of them spoke. By morning, the snow had ceased, not with a sudden stop, but a slow unraveling, as if the spiral had run out of thread. The air was so still that every sound, even the creak of the floor beneath Ellen's foot, seemed too loud, too real. At first light, Ellen stepped outside. The snow around the cottage was marked with patterns, not footprints, not animal tracks, symbols, drawn in the snow with astonishing precision. Circles within circles, interlocking lines, crescents and slashes. Some ancient, some unknown. They wrapped around the house like a net. She didn't call for Godefroy. She simply stared. In the center of each symbol, placed with care, was a small object. A pebble, a pine cone, a lock of hair, a button, a broken bit of pottery, a tiny carved tooth. 13 symbols in total, each different, each facing the house. She walked to the first, a spiral marked by a white stone and a piece of ribbon. Then to the second, a crescent holding a sprig of dried rosemary. At the third, she stopped, because she recognized what had been placed at its heart. A scrap of cloth from Isolde's swaddling, the one she had lost months ago, the one that had vanished during the last autumn wash. She knelt, touched it. It was warm. She didn't bring any of the offerings inside. Instead, she swept snow across each mark, careful not to break the shape, only to cover it. Then she returned to the house, bolted the door behind her, and burned sage at every threshold. When Godefroy asked what she'd seen, she said only, "They've marked the lines." He understood. He didn't ask more. That night, Isolde didn't sleep. She lay in bed with her eyes wide, unblinking, watching the ceiling. "They're waiting for the door," she whispered. "What door?" Ellen asked. Isolde slowly turned her head. "The one in me." Ellen's hands trembled. Godefroy stood, moving toward them, but Isolde reached out and placed a hand on her mother's chest. "It's not bad," she said, soft and calm. "It's just old, older than prayers." Ellen drew her close. "Why you?" she asked, voice breaking. Isolde paused. "Because I heard them before I was born. I listened. That was enough." She fell asleep mid-sentence, her hand still resting on Ellen's collarbone. Godefroy stayed up that night, sitting beside the door, the iron poker across his knees. Ellen didn't sleep. Instead, she lit 3 candles and placed them at the foot of Isolde's bed. Then she opened her grandmother's old book, the one with ink stains and wormholes and tiny drawings of creatures shaped like neither man nor animal. She read long into the night. By the light of the second candle, she found something. A page marked with a torn scrap of fur, a symbol scratched in ochre. Beneath it, a phrase written in a dialect even the priests refused to acknowledge. "The child who hears must be named thrice in blood, ash, and salt, or she will be heard forever." Ellen read it again, then again. She traced the edges of the torn page, her heart stuttering in her chest. Thrice named, in blood, in ash, in salt. It was not a ward. It was a binding, a way to anchor a soul too easily lifted. She looked at Isolde, still sleeping, still distant, still whole, for now. By dawn, Ellen had made the preparations. She swept the house clean with a birch broom. She wrapped Isolde in the red threaded shawl her own mother had once used for feast days. She drew a circle of ash on the floor, one the size of her daughter's small frame, and laid out a bowl of water laced with salt and crushed rose hips. Godefroy did not question her. He stood watch, one hand resting on the door, the other gripping the old brass bell from the chapel, one he had quietly taken 2 nights before. Ellen waited until the sun rose. Then she carried Isolde to the circle. She spoke her daughter's name aloud, once in a whisper, once in a breath, once with a tremble. Then she cut her own palm and let 3 drops fall into the ash. Salt came next, a thin line across Isolde's brow, and finally, a smear of soot pressed to the girl's chest. Each name spoken, each gesture done with hands that shook but did not hesitate. When it was over, Isolde opened her eyes, and for the first time in many days, she wept. Not in fear, but in relief. "You remembered me," she whispered. Ellen knelt, gathering her close. "I never forgot." Isolde buried her face into her mother's shoulder and sobbed without sound. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, aimless, unpatterned. The spiral had ended, but something else had begun. Winter had begun to wane. Not in warmth, the cold still clung to the earth like a lover reluctant to part, but in tone. The light lasted longer. The snow, once crystalline and pure, now bore streaks of ash and fallen pine needles. Icicles wept. The trees creaked not just from weight, but from the slow stretch of something beneath their bark awakening. In Leofum, the villagers began to emerge again. Quietly, cautiously, they did not speak of the symbols in the snow. They did not ask about the weeping wind or the boy who had vanished without a trace. But they lit more candles in their windows, placed stones at their doorsteps, and whispered older names when passing beneath bare trees. And they looked toward Ellen's home with something like reverence or fear. Ellen did not leave the cottage often now. There was nothing for her beyond its walls. Her life had folded inward, like a hand closing around a flame. Isolde remained close, always within reach, always within sight, though she seemed lighter, quieter, as if part of her had been loosened and gently tucked away. The binding had changed something, not just in the child, but in the house. The air was calmer. The walls groaned less. The shadows no longer curled quite so long at the edges of candlelight. The mirror above the basin, which had been covered for weeks, could now reflect without shimmer. The hearth burned steady, but Ellen didn't trust peace anymore. She waited, as all mothers do, for the tremble beneath still water. And it came. It came quietly, 3 days after the last ribbon, though no ribbon had been left. Only a breath, a stirring in the folds of the linen drying by the fire. Ellen had reached for a towel and found, pressed between its folds, a single black thread, smooth, coarse, familiar. Not silk, but something older, something that smelled faintly of moss and rain. She set it aside without touching it. That night, she dreamed. In her dream, Isolde stood in the center of a ring of stones, arms outstretched, her shawl fluttering like wings. Around her stood figures, tall, not cloaked but shadowed, as if drawn from ink. They held no weapons. They spoke no words, but each held a mirror. Ellen moved toward them, but her feet sank into the earth. She tried to call her daughter's name, but the sound caught in her throat and shattered. Isolde turned her head in the dream and looked directly at her, and her mouth moved. No sound, just 3 words, spoken with perfect stillness. "You cannot follow." Ellen awoke with the taste of salt on her lips and a dull ache behind her eyes. The thread was gone. She didn't tell Godefroy. Instead, she sat beside Isolde's bed and watched her breathe. The girl looked more like herself now, her cheeks full again, her lashes soft against her skin. But she had taken to humming to herself once more, little tunes with no melody, no pattern. She would stare into the fire for long stretches, then blink and ask, "Did I speak?" And once, while eating bread and honey, she looked up at Ellen and said, "The door inside me is quieter now." Ellen only nodded. In the days that followed, she returned to the book. Her grandmother's ink had faded in many places, but some symbols still remained, dark, firm, etched in the margins as if scratched by nail. She studied the sections on boundary rights, on the rituals of naming, on the old belief that children closest to the veil must be anchored 3 times, not once. Thrice bound. The first was with intention, the second with blood, the third with truth. Ellen didn't know what that meant, until Isolde, one afternoon, while combing her doll's hair with a chicken bone, said, "They only take what is not claimed." "I claimed you." Ellen replied, kneeling beside her. Isolde nodded. "But did you tell them why?" Ellen hesitated. "Because I love you." "Is that enough?" Isolde asked, not unkindly. The question hung between them like steam in winter air. That night, Ellen found the truth. It was not in the book. It was in memory. In the night before Isolde was born. The storm, the candlelight, the cry that came too early too fast, the cord wrapped once around the neck, the stillness before the breath, the cold, and the moment before the wail when Ellen had whispered, "Don't go. I don't care if you're whole. I don't care if you're marked. Just stay. I'll take you." It had been a bargain, one whispered into the dark, a truth spoken across a line. That was the third binding. Love not for what should be, but what was. So Ellen told her daughter the story, every word of it. And when she was finished, Iseult, silent and still, climbed into her lap, pressed her face into her mother's chest, and whispered, "Then I'm yours, all the way." Ellen wept, not with fear, but with completion. Outside the wind stirred, not harsh, not cold, just a soft shift of air through the branches. The trees exhaled, and somewhere beyond them, something listened and stepped back. The wind did not return the next night. For the first time in months, the air outside the cottage held no whisper, no rustle, no pull. The silence was not hollow, not waiting, but whole, final, as though something had ended and left no thread trailing behind it. Ellen noticed it the moment she stepped out to fetch water. The snow no longer curved in unnatural patterns. No symbols greeted her at the threshold. No scent of memory clung to the frost. The world was simply cold, clean, and still. She stood for a long while with the bucket in her hand, staring up at the morning sky. It was pale, not yet blue, but touched with the faintest warmth at the edges. She had forgotten how quiet the land could be when it wasn't watching her. Inside, Iseult slept late. Her breathing was slow and deep, and when she stirred, it was with the stretching grace of a child truly rested. She no longer murmured in her sleep. Her eyes no longer flitted behind closed lids, and when she opened them, she smiled. Ellen returned to her side, pressed her forehead gently to her daughter's. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Light," Iseult answered, "but not floating, like I've landed." That day, Ellen lit a fire not for warding, but for warmth. She peeled apples, she boiled barley, she folded blankets not in ritual, but in rhythm. The kind of rhythm that keeps a home whole, the kind passed down from hands to hands, wordless and steady. Godefroy repaired the fence that had sat half-broken since the storm and early frost. He whistled while he worked, off-key and soft. When Ellen stepped outside to hand him bread, he kissed her hand without a word. There was no celebration in the house, no grand relief, only the slow return of peace. Ellen watched Iseult play by the hearth, arranging stones and bits of wood into simple patterns, not spirals, not symbols, but the outline of a house. She laid a stick at each side like a door frame and placed a stone in the center. "Who lives there?" Ellen asked. "Me," Iseult said. "Only you." Iseult thought for a moment. "Me and the girl with the ribbon." Ellen's heart slowed, just slightly. She knelt beside her daughter. "She's still here?" Iseult shook her head. "She left when I told her the story you told me. She said that's how you make a name stay, by putting it in a story." Ellen swallowed hard. "What was her name?" Iseult frowned. "I don't remember." Then she smiled. "But I think she's okay now. I think she remembered who she used to be." That evening, a crow flew over the cottage, just one. It landed briefly on the roof, cawed once, then flew toward the forest. Ellen followed it with her eyes. The woods no longer looked strange. They were bare, still, deep, as they should be. No longer leaning, no longer watching. The trees no longer felt like bones. They were trees again. She closed the shutters that night, not in fear, but to keep the warmth in. And for the first time in weeks, she let the fire die before sleep. That night, Ellen dreamed. She stood on the hill just beyond Leopham, where the old stone stood, moss-covered and half-buried. In the dream, the sky was gold and gray, the wind slow, the grass soft. Iseult was beside her, holding her hand. Ahead stood the girl with the ribbon, her hair long and unbound, her eyes the color of winter twilight. She wore no shoes. Her feet were pale and clean. In her hand, she held the final ribbon. It was gray, neither bright nor dark, just simple, neutral, whole. She offered it to Ellen, not as a gift, not as a warning, but as a token of parting. Ellen took it, and the girl turned, stepped between the stones and disappeared, not into mist, not into shadow, but into distance, into a place that was not here. Ellen awoke with the ribbon still in her hand. Not dreamt, real. It lay soft across her palm, weightless as breath, and when the candlelight touched it, it shimmered once, then dulled, like something that had finished its work. She did not bury it. She did not burn it. She placed it inside her grandmother's old book, between the pages where the ink had faded and the margins held silence. A closing. That day, Iseult hummed a new tune. It was light, open. When Ellen asked what it was, Iseult said, "I don't know. It just came." And Ellen believed her. Because some songs are born when silence is finally allowed to rest. Spring announced itself not in birdsong, but but in the loosening of the earth. The frost, once firm and unyielding beneath Ellen's boots, began to sag with each step, turning to soft mud that pulled gently at her soles. The snow retreated not in waves, but in shyness, withdrawing in corners and hollows, leaving behind the smell of damp wood and thawing roots. Leopham stirred cautiously, as if it too had survived something unspeakable. The people emerged slowly from their shuttered homes, eyes squinting against a sun that no longer burned with the cold light of winter. Doors were unlatched. Chickens wandered again. The well's ice crust cracked and gave way to water that shimmered instead of groaned. But no one asked questions. There were no mentions of vanished children or strange wind songs or the ribbons that once hung from trees with names unspoken. Instead, they began to rebuild their rhythms, repairing tools, planting early beans, trading flour for eggs, weaving the year back together from where it had been torn. Ellen moved through these days like a woman walking along the edge of a memory. She swept the floor at dawn. She boiled milk with lavender. She stitched a new shawl for Isolde, this one the color of ash bark and dusk sky. And she listened, not for whispers or knocks or music from the trees, but for quiet, for the kind of quiet that comes after something ends. Isolde herself was blooming. There was no other word for it. Her skin held color now, not the pale stillness of winter, but the pink warmth of movement, of breath. Her eyes no longer lingered on empty corners. She played again, not solemnly, not as if enacting old rituals, but with abandon, tossing wooden buttons in the dirt, chasing smoke from the hearth, singing to the hens. One morning, as Ellen brushed her hair and wove the ends into a simple braid, Isolde said, "I want to learn to write." Ellen paused. "Yes," she said, "with letters, like in the big book with the deer drawings." Ellen smiled. "That's a prayer book." "I like the shapes," Isolde said. "They look like fences, like little rooms." Ellen's throat tightened. "Then I'll teach you," and she did. Each morning they sat at the table, charcoal between their fingers, drawing crooked lines on the back of old parchments Ellen had saved from her wedding, faded lists, receipts, promises signed and sealed. Isolde's letters were uneven but determined. She didn't ask what they meant at first. She only asked how they felt to make. "It's like planting something," she said once, "and waiting for it to grow into sound." Ellen kissed her forehead. "That's exactly what writing is." They began to go walking again, never far, just to the edge of the pasture where the snowdrops had begun to bloom in pale, nodding clumps. Isolde would collect feathers, stones, and bits of bark, arranging them into lines that made sense only to her. One day, she paused and pointed at a patch of moss near the base of an old oak. "That's where I remember," she said. Ellen knelt beside her. "Remember what?" "The first song," Isolde whispered, "before the world, when it was just breath and sleep." Ellen didn't reply. She placed her hand over Isolde's and let the silence stretch between them. Later, as they walked back, Isolde asked, "Do you think she's still there? The girl with the ribbon?" Ellen looked up at the tree line. The woods stood quiet, unbowed. "I think she's home now," she said, "wherever that is." Isolde thought about this. "Maybe she watches other children now," she said. "Ones who haven't been named yet." Ellen nodded. "Maybe." They reached the cottage as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long golden streaks across the yard. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. The wind smelled of moss and thawing pine. That night, Ellen pulled the book from the chest beneath the bed. The old book, the one with the faded edges, the drawings of deer and stars, the binding cracked from years of prayer and things unspoken. She opened it slowly and found the page where she had pressed the gray ribbon. It was still there, still soft, still quiet. She reached for her ink pot and a broken quill, and at the bottom of the page, below the symbols no one now remembered how to read, she wrote a single line in careful, trembling hand. She stayed. Isolde slept soundly that night. The fire burned slow, and in the early hours as the light of pre-dawn crept across the hearth, Ellen dreamt of nothing at all. No shadows, no laughter, no wind, only warmth, only weight. The sweet, honest gravity of being held to earth, not by fear, but by love. By the time the first full rain arrived, the earth was ready. It came not as a storm, but as a gentle, endless falling, steady and warm, soaking into the thatch, turning the fields to loam, calling up worms and tiny roots and memories buried beneath frost. It tapped against the windows in a rhythm older than song. It breathed through the chimney like a lullaby. Ellen woke to the sound and did not rise at once. She lay still, Isolde curled against her side, both of them wrapped in the thick quilt Ellen had stitched before the girl was born. Squares of old tunics, blankets, bridal linens, every thread a thread of memory. Rain meant rest. Rain meant staying close. So they did. She made porridge slow that morning, stirred it in wide, deliberate circles, letting the oats swell and soften. Isolde watched from her stool with her chin resting on her fists, half dozing, her braid falling forward over one shoulder like a wet rope. The rhythm of days had returned, but it was not the same rhythm as before. Something in the pattern of life had shifted. Not broken, not haunted, just deeper. Godefroy came in soaked from the shed, set down a basket of wet kindling, and pulled off his boots without a word. He moved differently now, slower, as if his limbs had remembered the weight of what had passed, as if his breath was tethered to something more solid than before. He ruffled Isolde's hair as he passed and kissed Ellen's temple. These were the rituals now, small, wordless, rooted. That afternoon, as the rain eased into mist, Ellen and Isolde sat at the table again. Today's letter was S, sharp, soft, serpentine. Isolde scratched it onto a bit of parchment with the tip of a scorched stick. "What does it stand for?" Ellen asked gently. "Sorrow," Isolde answered without sadness. Ellen paused. "Do you feel sorrow?" Isolde shook her head. "But I remember it, like a door that doesn't open anymore." She leaned in close to the page, eyes narrowed. "Also stay," she added, "and safe, and still." Ellen smiled. "And spring." Isolde brightened, "and soft." They wrote the letter 5 times, then placed the parchment near the hearth to dry. Isolde placed a small stone on the corner to keep it from curling. It was her favorite, round, speckled, warm to the touch, even in winter. A stone she claimed had come from before. Later, when the rain let up just enough to lift the scent of the soil into the air, Ellen opened the front door and let it in. The smell of growth, of moss and mud and seeds waking underground. She stood for a long while, her hand on the door frame, watching the droplets hang from the branches, listening to the hush. Then she stepped out barefoot. The earth was cold and soft, slick with new life. She didn't go far, just to the old bench under the eaves. Isolde followed, wrapping a shawl around herself, eyes half lidded with comfort. Together they sat and listened, not for danger, not for voices, but for the ordinary sounds, the cluck of hens settling in the mud, the creak of a tree loosening its limbs, the far-off whistle of the blacksmith's son calling his dog. Every sound a sign that the world still turned, that it had let them stay. Isolde leaned against her. "I think they're still out there," she said. Ellen didn't ask who. "I think so too," she replied. Isolde's fingers curled around the end of her mother's sleeve. "But they're quiet now," she said, "and we're not." That evening, Ellen reached for her grandmother's book again, not to ward, not to bind, just to write. On a fresh page, in her own careful script, she wrote, "A girl was once marked, and then she was named, and then she was held. And holding was the oldest magic of all." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. In the cradle where Isolde once slept, she placed a folded square of cloth, gray ribbon stitched into a ring. Beside it, the stone. The charcoal written S, not offerings, reminders, proof that they had come through. Later, as Isolde slept with her cheek against Ellen's ribs, she murmured in her dreams. Not in the old language, not in riddles, just a word, over and over. Here, here, here. And Ellen, even in sleep, understood. The first crocuses bloomed the following week. Shy, purple mouths opening against patches of stubborn frost, as if daring the winter to return. Ellen found the first one at the edge of the pasture, near the place where the snow had lingered longest. It seemed impossibly delicate. The petals trembled in the breeze, thin as skin, veined like memory. She knelt beside it, ran a finger gently along one petal's edge, and whispered a word of thanks, not to a god, not to the earth, but to the moment itself, because it meant something had begun, again. She brought one flower back to the house and placed it in a chipped clay cup beside Isolde's writing slate. The girl had taken to drawing as much as writing now, filling the back of each practice sheet with swirls and lines and small figures with 2 wide eyes and long fingers. "These are dreams," she explained one day. "They don't always remember what they look like, so I draw them how they feel." Ellen didn't ask which dreams. She only kissed the top of her daughter's head and brought her more charcoal. Godefroy was building again, a fence this time taller and straighter than the last. He didn't say it was for safety. No one said that anymore. He simply said the land was waking and would need boundaries again. Ellen understood. She spent her days weaving, not charms, not protective cords, but baskets, mats, long strips of braid to trade for grain. Her fingers welcomed the return of usefulness. It was a kind of forgetting, a kind of stitching her life back into place. But at night, she still checked the window twice. On the eve of the full moon, Isolde began to hum again. It was a tune Ellen hadn't heard before, high, lilting with little leaps in rhythm. It reminded her of water over pebbles, of spring wind weaving through pine needles. She asked, "Where did you hear that one?" Isolde paused, considered. "I think I made it," she said, "but maybe I borrowed it." Ellen nodded. Some songs came that way, part gift, part inheritance, part echo. That night, the moon cast its light fully across the floorboards. Isolde lay in her bed with arms outstretched, as if letting the light settle on her like a blanket. Her breath was steady, her face soft. No murmurs, no movement. Ellen stayed up long after Godefroy had fallen asleep. She sat by the hearth, a cup of warm milk in her hands, the fire down to embers. She didn't write. She didn't mend. She simply was. Outside, an owl called once. No answer came. She rose near midnight and checked the window. The fields were pale with moonlight, glistening in a way they hadn't for months. Nothing moved. And yet she felt something. Not dread, not fear, recognition. She stepped outside barefoot. The earth was cold but not biting, soft, damp. The air tasted like iron and moss. She walked only a few steps before she saw it, near the fence post, resting on a flat stone, a ribbon. But this one was different. It was gray like the last, but thinner, shorter. Torn at one edge, the fibers frayed. Tied around it was a sprig of something dry and silvered, wormwood, or perhaps faded sage. A plant that repels, or welcomes, depending on how it's given. Ellen didn't touch it at first. She crouched, looked at it carefully, then tilted her head toward the trees. The woods remained still. She waited. And when no wind rose, no call came, no breath stirred, she reached out and took it. It was light in her hands, lighter than any before. She turned and walked back into the cottage, shut the door behind her, and placed the ribbon on the table. Then she returned to Isolde's bedside and watched her sleep until morning. When the sun rose, Isolde blinked awake and sat up with a yawn. She looked toward the window, then toward her mother. "Did you see her?" she asked. "Who?" Isolde shrugged. "The one who left the goodbye." Ellen felt her breath catch. "Is that what it was?" Isolde nodded. "She's not coming anymore. She says I'm not hers now. She said that means I'm free." "Does that make you sad?" Ellen asked softly. "No," Isolde said, "just bigger." Ellen gathered her daughter into her arms, held her close, and felt the warm beat of her heart. Not distant, not fading, not borrowed, fully hers, wholly here. That day they hung the ribbon above the hearth, not hidden, not feared, but honored. A goodbye, yes, but also a thank you. The days stretched longer with each passing sun. The ground dried beneath the rain-washed grass, and the first green shoots pushed up through last year's decay. The stream, once locked in silence beneath a shell of ice, babbled again, and birds began to nest in the rafters of the sheds. In Leopham, the rhythm of planting had returned. Shovels and spades replaced charms and salt. Prayers were now for weather and seed, not for protection. But inside Ellen's cottage, nothing was hurried. Spring moved through her home as gently as a breath, as if it too had waited long enough. Isolde woke before sunrise most mornings, not out of fear or dreams or voices. She simply rose because she wanted to see the light before anyone else. Ellen often found her at the window, legs folded beneath her, watching the sky turn from ink to pearl. "I like the time before the birds," she said once. "It's quiet, but it's not empty." Ellen knew what she meant. There were different kinds of quiet. The hush of fear, the stillness of waiting, and this, the quiet that follows survival. The kind that breathes, that stretches, that makes room. Isolde had grown taller over winter. Her limbs were still thin, but steady, her gaze brighter, and her voice more sure. She laughed more now, sudden, startled laughter that came from the belly, sometimes for no reason at all. Once, while washing their hands in the stream, she cupped a silver minnow in her palms, held it for a moment, then let it slip through her fingers with a gasp and a grin. It tickled, she giggled, shaking water from her wrists, like it was trying to remember me. Ellen only smiled and kissed her damp head. One afternoon, Ellen brought down the old chest from the loft, the one that had belonged to her mother and her mother before her, full of ribbons, dried flowers, handkerchiefs with prayers stitched into the corners, old beads made from bone and clay, things carried forward from woman to woman, not out of need but out of meaning. She spread them out across the table. Isolde joined her, wide-eyed. "Are they spells?" she asked. "No," Ellen said softly. "They're stories." She picked up a red ribbon and wrapped it around her finger. "This was tied to my cradle the day I was born. And this?" Isolde pointed to a bit of blue wool. "That kept your grandmother's fingers warm the first winter she was alone." They spent hours there, arranging, untangling, remembering things Ellen hadn't spoken aloud in years. And as dusk fell and the light slanted across the floor, Isolde held up a strip of pale linen with a small embroidered mark, a faded spiral. "What's this one?" Ellen hesitated. "It belonged to someone else," she said. "Someone who walked alongside us for a while." Isolde traced the spiral with her finger. "Can I keep it?" Ellen nodded. "Yes, but it's not a charm anymore. It's only cloth now." "I know," Isolde said. "That's why I want it." She tied it into her braid. That night they slept with the windows open. The air was soft. The fire burned low. No iron on the sill. No ash at the threshold. Ellen woke only once, just before dawn, to find Isolde beside her, hand resting on her chest, breathing slow and even. And outside, through the thin white curtain, the sky was beginning to pink. In the weeks that followed, Isolde began visiting other cottages. She sat with Mistress Warren while she carded wool and helped the baker's daughter feed the geese. She spoke gently to the younger children and showed them how to draw spirals with a stick in the dirt, though she never explained what they meant. "They don't have to mean," she said. "They can just be." And when one boy asked if she remembered the missing children, the ones who hadn't come back, she nodded once, solemn. "They're not missing," she said. "They're just elsewhere, but they're not gone." And no one pressed further. Ellen continued to keep the ribbon over the hearth. It frayed a little more with each passing week. Sunlight bleached its gray into silver. Sometimes it fluttered even when the windows were closed. She never touched it, but she often sat near it with her sewing or her reading, or with her fingers laced through godefroids as they shared quiet moments without words. And she wrote more too. Not spells, not records, but stories. Small things, fragments. A description of how Isolde skipped across puddles, a recollection of her first word, the feeling of breath fogging against a cradle rail, the weight of love measured in sleepless nights and tiny miraculous hands. Once, in a moment when the rain tapped lightly on the shutters, Ellen wrote, "She came from the hush between worlds, but she stays for the warmth between hands." Isolde, reading over her shoulder, rested her chin on Ellen's arm. "I like that one," she said. Ellen turned to her. "Is it true?" Isolde shrugged, then smiled. "It feels true." Outside, the trees whispered like friends remembering old songs, and the sky, open and soft, held no sign of spirals, only clouds drifting east toward light. Summer arrived not with thunder or fire, but in the quiet blooming of things. The elder trees by the stream flowered overnight, tiny stars of pale cream against dark green leaves. Bees buzzed lazily from clover to clover, drunk on pollen and sun. Fields once pressed under silence and frost now shimmered with grain, gold and rising, like a promise kept too long. In Leopham, the villagers moved through their days with a reverence earned only by those who had lived through the kind of quiet that breaks you. They spoke softer, but smiled more. Laughter returned to doorways. Music, too, in the form of humming and idle fiddling. The world hadn't forgotten, but it had forgiven. So had Ellen. Her days fell into simple rhythms, tending the garden, kneading bread, brushing dew from the windowsills. The heaviness that had pressed itself into her spine all winter had lifted. It was still there, in the corners of her thoughts, in the way her eyes flicked toward the forest now and then, but it no longer let her. She was no longer watched. She was only seen. Isolde's hair had grown long and wild, curling at the ends in soft moss-like waves. She no longer spoke of dreams or of doors, but she had become a storyteller in her own way, not of warnings, but of what remained. She carried with her a pouch of stones, each one painted with symbols of her own design, some borrowed from books, others born in her hands, She gave them out as gifts, placing them in other children's palms with a word and a smile. "This one means stay," she would say. "This one means enough." And the children, not questioning, would hold them tight as they ran off again into the barley. One evening, near midsummer, the villagers gathered as they always had in years past around the clearing near the hill. There was no official cause for celebration, just the return of warmth, of breath, of the year not ending. It was the kind of gathering that had been absent for too long. Ellen brought fresh bread, godefroy, smoked trout. Isolde brought herself, barefoot and smiling, her sleeves rolled up and her cheeks flushed with joy. The fire was lit, the fiddle played. Children danced, awkward and unashamed, while the old folks sat on stumps and shared bread crusts and glances. When the sky turned violet, someone began to tell a story. It wasn't meant to be that kind of night, not sacred, not solemn, but the words spilled out anyway. A tale of a girl who wandered too far, who followed a song and vanished. The children grew quiet. Some of the younger ones inched closer to their parents. Isolde listened, head tilted, eyes dark in the firelight. When the story ended, no one spoke. Then Isolde rose and said, not loudly but clearly, "That's not the end." Everyone turned. "She came back," Isolde said. But she didn't tell anyone at first because she didn't know how. Silence. She had been somewhere quiet, and she had to learn how to be loud again. She had to remember how to touch things without fear, how to eat bread without tasting wind. A breeze stirred. She wasn't lost. She was remembering her shape, and when she was ready, she came back. One of the children asked, "How did she know it was time?" Isolde smiled, soft and sure. "She heard someone call her name like it mattered." A pause. Then the fiddler began to play again, slow and sweet, and the moment passed like all true moments do. Not forgotten, just folded gently into the fabric of everything else. That night, as they walked home beneath a sky swimming with stars, Ellen reached down and took Isolde's hand. "I didn't know you knew that story," she said. "I didn't," Isolde replied, "but it came when it needed to." The cottage was still when they returned, the hearth cold, the coals asleep. Ellen lit a single candle, not for light, just to say, "We are still here." And beside it, she placed the gray ribbon, now brittle and nearly translucent, coiled in its place like a final breath caught in time. She would keep it, always, not because she feared what might come, but because she remembered what had passed and what had remained. Isolde fell asleep quickly that night, curled against the wall with the blanket twisted at her feet. Ellen stayed up, watching the candle burn low. She no longer waited for knocks. She no longer listened for weeping. But when the flame finally flickered and died, and darkness settled like silk across the floor, she closed her eyes and whispered 3 words into the stillness. "I remember you." The night said nothing back, and that, at last, was enough.